Call this meeting of Tacoma Park City Council to order. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mayor Williams.
I'm here.
Councilmember Daniel Cohen. Councilmember Grimes.
Here.
Councilmember Mail.
Here.
Councilmember Schultz.
Here.
Councilmember Seaman.
Present.
Councilmember Smith.
Here.
I just want to take a minute and just say that Councilmember Daniels Cohen will not be here tonight. I'm not sure when she will be back. She was in the hospital this weekend and had a hip replacement yesterday, and she has some other things going on as well. So we're not sure when she will be back at a council meeting, but I'm sure that everybody wants to let her know that we all wish her the best and hope for a speedy recovery. She's at Suburban Hospital and expects to be there another couple of days before going to rehab. And the various neighbors have been helping out and helping with some of the tasks that she takes care of. And I know that everybody will keep her in their thoughts. And we appreciate all of the help that she's receiving, and as I say, hope for a speedy recovery.
Excuse me, Mayor, you mentioned that she's at Suburban Hospital. Is she accepting guests, visitors at this point?
Not at this point.
Okay, thank you.
It may be in another day or two, but not at this point.
Maybe after she moves to rehabilitation.
I think that's the most likely.
Okay, thank you.
There are no additional agenda items this evening. As far as upcoming meetings, reminder that next Monday, February 18th, city offices will be closed for the President's Day holiday, but the Public Works facility will be open for an open house from 10 in the morning until noon, and this is a chance for people who haven't seen the renovated Public Works facility and all of the various aspects of that renovation, including some of the green features, to go up to Public Works and take a tour and see the new facility. If the city manager wants to just mention anything else about that particular celebration that you can add in the way of details?
No, but I strongly urge people to go. I strongly urge people to go because it's just very attractive, and you'll see the really good finishes that are durable and green, and it's something that we can be proud of. I'm really happy about it.
And next Tuesday, February 19th, is the city council meeting for next week, and we, depending on the outcome of this evening's work session discussion, may be adding a public hearing on that agenda. And then we have some work session discussions of the police department's annual report and a discussion with the police chief, and also a discussion of external requests for funding for large grant requests. The following Monday, the 25th, we have some work session discussions about the tenant opportunity to purchase law, and we also have continued discussion of financial matters and budget priorities, and we've tentatively got a discussion for the proposed charter amendment resolution about elections. So that's just a couple of upcoming items with a tentative item or two just to let people know. I don't have anything for the record, so the next thing would be public comment period. And if anybody wants to comment on anything not on our voting agenda this evening, so if you have any comments on anything that is a work session item for this evening or anything not on the agenda, this is your opportunity to testify, and we'd ask that you please identify yourself and keep your comments to 3 minutes. And for those of you who haven't,
Are you ready?
Who haven't used this podium, it does raise up and down, and
This here?
the whole podium goes up and down. There's a button there on the front left.
Okay.
And we use a timer, and you'll see lights and a sound, but
I won't need the timer. I don't know if that won't be that long. Okay, well, my name is Richard Levine, and I live at 7420 Cedar Avenue. The side of my house extends about 1/2 block from Cedar to Birch along Philadelphia Avenue. And I'm here to request that you hold public hearings on any MOU affecting through lanes on 410. My memory of road construction goes back to the 1950s. Since that time, I've seen neighborhoods bulldozed and destroyed in an unrelenting process to feed the funds for highway construction. Our community and its historic character has been and will always be at risk of destruction from highway development. And we must set up every barrier and take every precaution, and unfortunately never think that we have done anything but temporarily contain this threat. Again, please have a public hearing on the MOU and use the alternative language on the widening of 410 proposed by Historic Tacoma. And I hope that in no way we cede any control of 410 that we now have. Thank you.
Thank you.
Mayor,
Yes.
I wonder if it would just be helpful for people, for any sort of read of the language of the legislation that we're talking about. So I know that many members of the public have heard about this issue, but I don't know that very many of them have seen the language in the proposal that we're speaking about. You know, the sentence that talks about prohibition on funding.
I'm happy to do that, just so that people have that language. And for anybody who's wondering, this is in the work session agenda item for this evening, agenda item number 6, and I believe there are copies of that over on the wall. And the pertinent language for this proposed bill is first the purpose sentence at the beginning: for the purpose of prohibiting the Department of Transportation from spending any funds for the construction or reconstruction of Maryland Route 410 through the city of Tacoma Park that will involve the addition of a new vehicular through lane to the highway. And then the highlighted language that would be added would be: the department may not spend any further funds for the construction of Maryland Route 410 through the city of Tacoma Park in Montgomery County that will involve the addition of a new through lane for motor vehicles. So, if that's helpful.
Diana Cohn, 16 Jefferson Avenue, president of Historic Tacoma, and I'm here on behalf of Historic Tacoma. Before I get to 410, I'd like to say a few words about Kay, our missing council person. There are no gold stars tonight because Kay is not here. She's in the hospital. Kay, please know that we have an honorary gold star waiting for your return. The hearts and prayers of the community go out to you and Jack and Buddy and your family. Thanks. 410. I'm going to first address the MOU because I think that's really what there has been a lot of debate about, and we have some we have some specific recommendations there. You did reference the state bill. Historic Tacoma greatly appreciates the time and the effort that the city and the staff have put in on this crafting an agreement that will protect our community against the future widening of 410. And we acknowledge it has been a very difficult task, and we appreciate all the efforts. Before I do that, I just want to pass these around because I'm going to reference this is the same edited MOU that appears on the website. That is our current recommendation passed by the board, and I'm just going to refer to that in this. Historic Tacoma is pleased to see the new revisions in the whereas that make considerable progress toward defending the status of 410 itself. We do, however, have a few additional recommendations that we believe will help strengthen the city's position on the sections regarding sidewalks, signage, and permitting. I've just passed out the edits, but for the benefit of the public, I'm going to highlight a few of them. The first whereas on page 2, we suggest that a reference to the historic district status of 410 might add the historic protections that otherwise are not referenced in the MOU. Second, the the last whereas talks about the traveling public, which it identifies as the state and the county, but doesn't specifically reference the city, and we just suggest that that might be a good addition. On the maintenance, we suggest adding removal of fallen trees to the list because that's been an issue in the various storms. And finally, we would like to see a clarifying statement that the MOU is specifically to give permission to the state for them to do maintenance beyond the curb, so that there's a reference, that there's a difference between curb to curb and beyond the curb. And Mary Beth has some additional comments. Yeah.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Mary Beth Oakes. I live at 7502 Holly Avenue. And I, too, want to thank the council and the staff for the work you've done on the MOU. It is an evolving document that's really elevated the standing of Tacoma Park. But we do believe, as Diana mentioned, that additional refinements are needed. We think these are easily incorporated, and the incorporations are demonstrated in the document that Diana just handed out. Historic Tacoma remains united in our opposition to widening of Maryland Route 410 for any vehicular use, and therefore urge a final MOU that is clear and unambiguous in its wording, and that the intent of the council is to secure protections against widening the road. Critical that the MOU recognizes the city as an equal partner in maintenance and maintenance determinations. Recognition of that partnership requires at least several modifications in the MOU. One, Diana mentioned, we'd like to see a whereas added. The language is on page 2. It's the first MOU, and essentially it's basically very simply to state that Route 410 is part of the local and national registered historic district. We'd also like to see a general provision in the general provision section, new language, which would be letter F, that states, in all instances, no work shall proceed until all city issues have been resolved to the satisfaction of both the city and SHA. So again, it gets to the partnership between the city and SHA. Similarly, the MOU must eliminate sweeping language, refers to SHA as having, quote, sole and absolute discretion, end quote. And I know you've worked hard to take that out of some provisions in the MOU, but it still remains in Section 5A under signage. Third, under the general provision section, we'd like to see a new H that clarifies that SHA would agree to a project review by Montgomery County Historical Preservation Commission and the Maryland Historic Trust, and that SHA would abide by any review related to these documents. Similar arrangements, I believe, have been made with Montgomery County College in 2002, so that sets a precedent that that could occur. And then fourth, our recommendation is that we extend the response time for concerns in the comment period to 30 days. Currently, under the utility section, as you know, it's only 3 days, and in other sections it's 10. We think that the city and the residents need a more appropriate time, being 30 days. And then one last point on the MOU before I make a quick mention of the draft state legislation that you mentioned, Tim. Originally, the MOU negotiations between the city and SHA accompanied an easement document. Somewhere along that process, that document disappeared. And Historic Tacoma asked the City Council to include an easement document as an accompaniment to a final MOU. The easement's an important document that reinforces the idea that the city has jurisdiction in areas of Route 410. It is an additional legal protection for us. Our attorney at Historic Tacoma can address further the easement issue and the need for permission to go beyond the curb. On another note, I want to commend Delegate Heather Mazier for her continued contribution to protecting Tacoma Park's historic integrity. We appreciate her draft proposal on Route 410. It's an important document because it provides intent that signals that there should be no widening of a road for vehicles in the future or now. Historic Tacoma respectfully notes a few changes to that document, and we will work with the delegate to secure those changes. For me, in closing, I'd like to, for Historic Tacoma to make two more recommendations. One is that we hope that you will confer with Historic Tacoma's attorney about incorporating the recommendations that we just outlined before a final MOU is adopted. And second, and perhaps most importantly, is that we ask, as did one of our neighbors, that you hold an advertised public hearing on the MOU before any vote is taken. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Robert Lanza. I live at 7215 Cedar Avenue. I've testified previously that I don't see any need for the city to have an agreement on this subject with the State Highway Administration. I think what the city should do is agree to do whatever needs to be done on 410 and not have an agreement with HHA at all, and just do what the city is required to do to own and maintain that road. That being said, the other thing that I'd like to say is that just from reading the email messages on our local Ward 1 listserv just between 5:30 and 6 o'clock this evening, probably a dozen or so people commented on the list that there should be a public hearing about this issue. That was just 1/2 hour's worth of reading. There's probably a lot more comments on our local listserv now. So subject to council schedule, I agree with other commenters that there should be a public hearing on this issue in addition to the work session. Thank you.
Just so I can clarify, the current schedule is the work session this evening and a session next week to vote on it, which would incorporate public comment. So it's not that anybody is trying to preclude any public comment. I just want to
I
make sure
understand
that's
that, but the current schedule is different than a formally advertised and scheduled public hearing. Before the schedule vote, something between today and the schedule vote is what I think people are asking to have happen, not just a public hearing and then vote on the same at the same council session.
Okay, thanks.
Good evening. I'm Susan Hartley. I live at 7667 Maple Avenue, Tacoma Park. I have something to read here. So the tenants here tonight represent tenants associations in several apartment buildings in Tacoma Park. As tenants, we all share a desire to have safe rental housing in Tacoma Park. We need to feel safe going to our landlord to request repairs and not be afraid that the landlord will give us a notice to move out. Or if the landlord gives us a notice of a rent increase and we think the increase is wrong, then we need to feel safe coming to the city to get the issue sorted out. Landlords in Tacoma Park can give tenants a notice at the end of their lease to move for no reason. So we are afraid that if we complain about our needing repairs, the landlord could give us a notice to move out and it would be entirely legal. The landlord's real reason may be retaliation for requesting repairs, but we will never know, and the landlord never have to prove it was not retaliation. Landlords should have a legitimate reason to get rid of a tenant. So this law is really bad for us tenants that live. In other words, they can put us out. And I've been in this building for 20 years, and I am president of the Tenants Association, and I give them the blues. And I know that Parkview Towers is getting ready to have a big renovations, and we're looking forward to this. But it really makes us very nervous knowing that I've been there over 20 years, and you know I'm paying a lower rent than a lot of other people, and they might just want my apartment to get higher rent. And that's very nerve-wracking, and I hope that you all take this into consideration for us tenants. And keep an eye on us, please. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Tigania Harris. I'm here on behalf of the 7610 Tacoma Park Tenant Association, and I'm also here in support of the only allowing landlords to evict tenants for cause. My tenant association submitted a letter to the council to address this issue, and we would like to know if there's any follow-up with that.
I'd say that our understanding previously had been that we could not make certain changes to our law in terms of just cause eviction, and we are working to try and make sure that we can do something to protect tenants. But our understanding of state law is over the last, was it 2 years ago, I think, was that we could not provide certain protections, only the county could. Yeah, we've asked for some work on that at state, and we haven't heard back.
Okay, thank you.
Can push that left button on the left?
This one?
Yeah.
Okay.
Helps a little bit.
Great, thank you. Hi, my name is Jeff Plunges. I am a 16-year resident of Philadelphia Avenue, and I am basically here tonight to urge you to have a full advertised public hearing on the memorandum with the state. I believe that this is a very important issue. There are a few issues in the city that concern residents as much as state plans for this road that cuts right through the heart of the historic district. I can see from reviewing the MOU and the proposed legislation that there has been a lot of work by the staff on this issue, and I do appreciate that. I just feel that we are a small city, and we're dealing with a state with a lot more legal firepower than we have, and that a public hearing would help put more eyes on these important documents. And I think that this is a subject that deserves a lot more than an hour discussion at the City Council. So some sort of advertised public hearing where we would have the documents to review as citizens beforehand, and perhaps hear more from the city staff who worked on this, the State Highway Administration, if they would come, the attorneys who have vetted this to make sure that city interests are represented and how they're represented in these agreements, and from groups like Historic Tacoma, which I think is trying to do a thoughtful analysis of this. I would hope that their points could be addressed, and of course residents just to have an opportunity to speak out. So I hope you take that into consideration. Thanks.
Thank you. I'd encourage anybody interested in this issue to either stay for the work session discussion later this evening, or watch it at home on television, or watch it on the website after the meeting. And just a reminder that all of the documents about this have been on the city website for 2 weeks.
Good evening. I'm Jim DeLuigi, 7106 13th Avenue. I resided in Tacoma Park for over 40 years, participated in many activities on behalf of the city. I'm very concerned about this MOU regarding the highway. We've recently heard comments from people such as crossing guards, hearing from whoever the people are measuring out there, state employees or whoever they might be, that the roadway is planning to be widened. This is a great concern. I think the primary purpose of our city council is to protect and defend the interests of the city of Tacoma Park, not to help benefit the county or the state first. If the citizens of Tacoma Park are concerned about the potential widening, are concerned about the language in the agreement with the state, it needs to be vetted publicly. I've seen many issues in past years where contentious things have evolved. Eventually, they wind up being public hearings in some form or another. If they're not, we wind up having significant problems. We wind up having divergence of support within the city for our council members and for our mayor. So I think this thing has gone too far without a public hearing. I urge you to have it. Something as significant of this requires it. There's a great difference of opinion. There's a difference of opinion between two attorneys. If that's not enough to warrant a public hearing, I don't know what is. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, my name is Patrick Invalakani. I reside at 310 Ethan Allen, which is essentially 410. June 3rd of this year will be 10 years for me residing in Tacoma Park. I guess one of the reasons why I moved out here, having grown up in Silver Spring, was really just the small town feel of this town and this, the trees and the diversity of the city also. The first time I became aware of this issue was probably about 2 years ago when it was discussed here in the City Council. And the only way I really knew about it was because of the Historic Tacoma Park Society put a flyer on my door. Tonight, after working 14 hours, I get home. This is the only other way I found out about this. Otherwise, I would have been catching up on sleep. And so I guess I am a little concerned that this seems to... The first time I heard about this, I was a little suspicious. It just seems to me like if we own this part of the road, getting into any negotiations about agreements or discussions, basically we're going to give away rights, parts of it, or the ability to make future decisions. I work out in Greenbelt, and I spend my mornings going east on 410 and sometimes coming back west. And what I see is once I get past New Hampshire, it's 2 lanes. When I go to Bethesda on 410, heading west, I see 2 lanes. When I go through Tacoma Park, I see 1 lane. And what does that tell you? Somebody sees this as a choke point, okay? So I have my suspicions this needs to be made public, give the residents of Ethan Allen, 410, really the opportunity to vote on this in the city, widening this road, which I suspect is something somebody's thinking about, would just destroy what attracted me to Tacoma Park. Thank you.
Thank you.
Claire Delabar, been on 214 Philadelphia for 13 years now. Just want to say I'm a big fan of the city newsletter, and that's one of the primary ways I get information as an old-fashioned kind of person. I would strongly suggest perhaps having the patience to allow this public hearing, if you decide to have one, to be advertised on the front page through an article above the fold, so everybody that gets their information that way will know about the hearing as well. But I would strongly encourage the recommendations of Historic Tacoma, which has been absolutely crucial in alerting these issues to residents that are most affected and the whole city, and also to preserve the lifeblood of Tacoma. I live right near Holly, and I see all the school children walking to school every day. And with 2 lanes, it's not safe. I can only imagine what would happen if it's 3 or 4 lanes. And I don't know that there are many 4-lane roads in close proximity to so many school students that are so young. So I think it's a community issue and also a safety issue. And I would just ask a very thoughtful consideration of how long it takes to let everyone know about the public hearing in every modality that the city uses to communicate. Thank you.
Thank you.
Council members, Joe Edgell. I'm in the 1000 block of Elm Avenue. Apologize tonight because I'm kind of under the weather, but I felt it was important enough to come talk to you nonetheless, even though I'd be honest, rather be home in bed. Before I get to the 410 issue, I just want to say that I heard about Councilmember Daniels Cohen's condition, and I wish her a speedy recovery. I hope she's watching today, but we'd like to see her back here in this chair as soon as possible. With respect to the 410, Historic Tacoma obviously has brought out big support, and that's good, but there's a whole group of people who use 410 every day that aren't represented here, and those are the bicyclists. And I'd like to think that I speak for some of them as I ride that area very frequently. Unfortunately, Historic Tacoma's language that they would like substituted for the legislation that the city was proposing would prohibit any bike lanes. There's no space to put the bike lanes without some sort of curb movement and some sort of expansion. The language the city adopted initially and proposes to adopt is language will limit motor vehicle expansion. And I support the limit on motor vehicle expansion. I drive it, I get stuck in traffic too, but I don't want to see 4 lanes through Tacoma Park. At the same time, I'd like to make it much safer for cyclists, which it's not now. I know that at least one council member on in Tacoma does ride it and does feel safe, but I see a person after person riding the sidewalk, which is illegal, as most of you know. Can't ride the sidewalk. And rather than forcing people to do something illegal, I think it would be better to look at a long-term plan in consultation with the residents who live there and with Historic Tacoma in an effort to address this and to put some bike lanes. It also is something that we could significantly improve the environmental impact of the area. That road is not very good from an environmental impact. So in summary, thank you for the language that the council proposed. I appreciate that in the legislation. Whether you have a public hearing or not is not of interest to me, but I would like to see the language which Historic Tacoma proposed, which would prevent any vehicle expansion, including bicycle expansion, opposed and not adopted by the city. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lovelace.
Hello, my name is Pat Lovelace, your official peace delegate. And one thing I'd like to do is wish Kay Daniels Cohen a speedy recovery. I don't know how to give a hug over the TV, but I guess it's the only way to do it, Kay. And I hope you recover from your hip surgery. I can't wait to see you back here. I miss you. Just wanted to say I'm sure all your constituents and everybody else in the city miss you too, probably the county. But another thing I want to do is invite everybody to come down this weekend to the Keystone Pipeline demonstration in Freedom Park in D.C. We're protesting the building of a pipeline. It's going down through from Canada, right down through our country, through the Midwest where all the crops are grown, and down to the Gulf of Mexico. Untold hundreds of homes are going to be lost in the process of it. And it could be a great risk to our environment, as well as Canada's environment, too. So we're injuring 2 countries with that pipeline, not just ours, and the greedy quest for oil. We should be looking for more alternative energy sources that are clean, like wind and solar. I'm proud that Tacoma Park stands up for their environment, but I want to let them know what affects their environment affects the United States, and what affects the United States and the world affects Tacoma Park, whether we know it or not. But it does. And I would like to invite everybody to come down. Also, the President's presidential State of the Union address is on Tuesday night. I want to let you know. And also, I want everybody to write to Congress about the asking for the gun control bill to pass through with no watering down. And also, when Tacoma Park goes out to Annapolis to meet with the delegates on District 20 night, I want somebody to ask them all to please do away with the hollow point bullets, too. They do more injury and more suffering to somebody than the regular bullets do. At least with the regular bullets, you have a chance of surviving. But with the hollow points, you don't stand hardly a chance. And if you do, you're going to be in a lot of pain. And I don't think this city wants to see that happen to anybody, good or bad. We should not be allowing those kind of bullets to be manufactured. So please, come down to our demonstration and continue to write your congressman asking for gun control and asking for an end to the hollow point bullets. I don't hear hardly any mention whatsoever about those. But those are the ones that should have been banned a long time ago. And I'd like to see a ban on assault weapons, the other weapons too, like the magazines, the high-capacity magazines. And I'd like to see what we can do to make this world a better and peaceful place than it was when we got it. Thank you very much. And thank you, Kay Daniels, for everything you've done for me, too. Good night. Peace.
Thank you.
My name is Judy Hagopian. I live at 7420 Cedar Avenue. We also side Route 410, Philadelphia. one of the reasons, my husband and I have been living here for 30 years, and one of the reasons we moved here has been that this is a city that encourages community participation. And I am going to reiterate what people before me have said, and that is that you hold a public hearing, that it not be on the same day that you vote, because you know and I know that this would have a tremendous impact on all of Tacoma Park, not just those of us who live or are near Philadelphia Avenue. And just as one other thing, I've said this before, I watch the school children try to navigate that crosswalk. And I've seen near casualties. Myself, I have a hard time negotiating it, and I am an adult. So on behalf of the children, I just want to say any changes that would impact that intersection would be horrendous and frankly unethical.
Ms. Hagopian, which crosswalk are you referring to?
The
at Holly or Cedar?
The intersection of Cedar Avenue
Yeah, thank you.
and Philly, right near the library. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other public comments? Okay, thank you all. We will now go to council comments. Councilmember Mayle.
Thank you, Mayor. I too miss Kay tonight, and she's often my ride back and forth to meetings, and I walk down here tonight without her company, and I'll miss it going home tonight. Our thoughts are with her and Jack. A couple of issues since you're all here on 410. We're going to talk about it later on, but I really regret that some of the information that's been put out there, I think, gives a not completely honest portrayal of what the current draft is trying to do of the legislation. And I don't know of any of my colleagues up here or anyone in the city who has not been working extremely hard to try to get to make it impossible for State Highway to ever add another lane for cars on 410. And that's exactly the language that we thought we had achieved. And the issue, and one of the members of the audience here tonight spoke about it, I think the issue is really about a disagreement about things like bike lanes. But we have this great opportunity to get sort of 99% of what we want here with state legislation. And it may not come up again. You know, if any of you have ever worked on state legislation, you know how hard it is. In a short-term session with legislators who only work part-time to get something done, particularly something like this, something that's only a benefit to one individual community. It doesn't help anybody in Howard County or Baltimore City or anywhere else. It can be really hard to get something like this done. And this would be a huge victory for us to be able to make it impossible for State Highway to ever spend money adding a through lane for motor vehicles in 410 in Tacoma Park. I mean, to me, it was a slam dunk. And I know from all the constituent calls I've gotten tonight that people are very confused about what we're proposing. And that came about through emails that were sent out and other information that was distributed that I don't think fairly represents what city staff and city council and members of the public have tried to do. I want to jump to another issue, which I'm very excited about, which is some voting reforms that council has talked about at previous meetings and a work session. And Councilmember Grimes, I think, wants to talk about this as well. But I've spoken with the Young Democrats of Blair High School, the Young Democrats of Montgomery County, and we have, I think, a draft of what could be the language to change the charter to allow 16 and 17-year-olds to vote. We've passed that along to the city clerk to be able to move forward on, as well as language for a resolution to create a temporary task force that would focus on voting and how to make voting in city elections easier for people, to make voting and the information we get out to have it be something that attracts more representation from more of the community within Tacoma Park. It gets information into apartment buildings and other places, so we can essentially get more participation and more engagement in bodies like this. So we're really excited to be able to move that forward, and hopefully you'll see it on an agenda item in the near future. Thank you.
Councilmember Grimes.
Thank you. I will very happily expand on what Councilmember Mayle has said. There are three initiatives, as you mentioned, a right to vote resolution, a charter change that would create election day voter registration. In other words, after the 30-day deadline that exists right now before the election, and extend the vote to 16 and 17-year-olds. And then a change to landlord-tenant code that would allow for campaign access to rental apartment buildings, and that would require landlords to distribute electoral materials, including voter registration forms, to new tenants. There's a huge disparity in Tacoma Park in the voter registration rates between wards 1, 2, and 3, the homeowner-rich wards, and wards 4, 5, and 6, which have many apartment buildings in them. I should have the figures in front of me, but I don't. I believe that the aggregate difference, summing up the number of registered voters in wards 1, 2, and 3 versus 4, 5, and 6, was around 2,400 voters. That has repercussions in the mayoral elections, in any kind of referendums that might come before the council, and the priorities of the council. If people are not registered to vote, they can't turn out to vote, they can't affect city government as well as they would if we had didn't have these kind of disparities. So I very much see this as a positive move that the city can take to enfranchise additional individuals, not just for city elections, but for state, county, and federal elections. Moving on to the other points, I too very much miss Councilmember Daniels-Cohen this evening, and certainly am very concerned about her recovery. I wanted to mention to Ms. Hagopian, yes, she's still here, about the 410 and Cedar intersection. Based on community input, we did make a request to the State Highway Administration to evaluate that intersection for upgrades, 410 and Cedar. They denied it. They similarly denied a request to put in four-way blinking lights at Holly and 410, where residents have had accidents and near misses. Just about, I believe it was 8 or 9 days ago, a pedestrian was hit at that very intersection at 410 and Holly. But the State Highway Administration did their vehicle counts and all this kind of stuff, looked at records which don't account for near misses and are not necessarily exhaustive from our point of view, and certainly don't account for the residents' knowledge of the area, and they denied that request. I will mention just one other thing regarding 410, which is that a resident reported to me earlier today. I will call it a rumor, and I'm going to pass it on to you because it is perhaps a partial explanation of some of the things that we've heard tonight. And I will interject first that I very much do appreciate the contact that people have had directly with me and who have the people who have come to this meeting. The rumor was that the State Highway Administration was out in the Tacoma Junction area last week. This is third hand by the time it reached me, measuring the roadway for roadway widening. And this was passed on to someone who is in an official capacity who passed it on to a resident. So this kind of questionable information, as Councilmember Mail didn't use those words, but I'll use it, referred to is damaging. We do need to have a very rational process of examining what's going on here and motivations. And to that end, I definitely do support the call of the people who have come here tonight for a public hearing. Thank you.
Councilmember Schultz.
I want to first address the concerns that were brought here by some of the people who are representing tenants in the city. My ward, Ward 6, has an awful lot of rental units in it, including the New Hampshire Towers, which is one of the larger apartment buildings in the city, and many other rental units in smaller buildings, plus rental units that are in what look like single-family houses. And so I'm naturally going to be concerned about the issues that were raised. And I just want you to know that I hear you, that your voices aren't being ignored. I do agree that as long as a tenant doesn't violate their lease and pays the rent on time, that there shouldn't be any room for a landlord to arbitrarily and capriciously evict a tenant just because they want to. That just doesn't make sense to me. I'm not an attorney, but I do think common sense sometimes, the law and the common sense do overlap. So we're not the ones that make these laws, as the mayor just said, but we certainly can have influence on and how these things are written at the county level. We're going to continue to focus on it. Second, with regard to Route 410, I want to be fairly frank in what I'm going to say, is that we've been working on this issue, which is a very serious issue, for at least 2 years, if not longer. Tremendous amount of negotiating with the State Highway Administration. Long history there. I'm not going to go into it. But first we got to understand that everybody on this city council is on the same side as all the people who testified here this evening, or virtually everybody who testified here tonight. I mean, I heard some statements that were just factually incorrect. But other than that, you need to understand that we are very much conscious of the concerns about the fears of widening. And I understand the legitimacy of those fears. I'm not here to say, oh, calm down and don't worry about it. Quite the contrary. That's why we have spent so much time dealing with it. But I've heard suggestions that the city's attorney and the attorney for the historic Tacoma need to be talking to each other. They have been talking to each other. I've heard suggestions that citizens haven't had an opportunity to understand what the proposed MOU is, or haven't had a chance to testify on this. There's been numerous occasions over the last 2 years when we've sat here and listened to people and paid attention to people about these things. And as a result of a lot of that input we've heard from people, while I've been sitting up here, we've gone back to the table with SHA and said, certain things we need to change. The SHA has made a huge amount of has given up a huge amount of ground on this whole issue, and changed their positions considerably in our favor. And so when I hear requests for a public hearing, and I hear the comments that were made tonight, I'm puzzled what it is about the MOU that people don't understand. It's been on the website for 2 weeks. It's there to be read. I think it's fairly understandable. I mean, I don't think there's too much that could be confusing about it, but I will grant that there may very well be things in that MOU that are confusing or create uncertainty. And I think you're right to be asking questions. But from the comments that we heard from the historic Tacoma, who does have an attorney who has looked at this stuff about proposed changes in the MOU, were heard tonight. I would imagine some of them can be incorporated. I don't know that they can. But those proposals are certainly not terribly different from what is in the MOU right now. So to my mind, we're talking about what I would call minor changes. The historic Tacoma's position with regard to the proposed legislation, with regard to not allowing any widening of for any vehicles, including bicycles, I'm not going to support. I think that I don't believe that curbs are historic, and I don't believe anybody can tell me that a particular curb has been in a certain position for X number of years what I think are historic are the property lines and the buildings that sit there. If you did not have any buildings, it wouldn't be an historic district. And we, all of us up here, absolutely, positively want to protect the structures in the historic district as well as outside the historic district. We don't want to see anybody's property be eaten up by the highway. So we're all, frankly, in favor of keeping the road exactly where it is, but we do recognize that there are certain physical things that have to be accommodated that are outside the curbs, whether you're talking about stormwater work or bioretention basins or electrical work that has to be done underground, or improvement of sidewalks in order to meet federal ADA requirements. All of those things may require moving a curb here and there in order to make Route 410 work as efficiently and safely as we can possibly want it to work. I don't want the SHA to come back to us when we ask them to do a fix on 410 for safety reasons and have them say, oh, well, we can't, because the state law that you guys got passed through the state legislature doesn't allow us to do what you want us to do. So even we want you to do it, we can't do it. So we need to give the state and the city certain flexibility to make some very minor changes that may be needed to improve traffic flow, to improve pedestrian safety, and on a whole host of other things.
And can we continue that discussion in the work session later this evening?
Well, the folks that I'm speaking to may not be here at the work session, and I want them to be aware of this now. That's why I'm speaking on the subject now. I don't usually take this long on a subject, but I just have been very concerned. It's interesting, 410 doesn't even go through my ward, but I hear people's concerns. I just want to give some reassurance to all of those who are concerned that we're pretty much all on the same page here. If anybody sees that I'm like off in right field and I don't get it, call me. Send me an email. I'd like to understand where my misunderstanding is, and that's a genuine, sincere statement, because we want to get this thing right. And finally, I just want to say to Kay, if she's listening, we're looking forward to when you get back. We have our hopes up that your recovery will be short. I know that the age that she is the same age I am, and I know that having hip surgery can be pretty devastating, and we wish her rapid recovery. I certainly do. Thank you.
And I've just got a couple quick things to mention. As somebody mentioned earlier, District 20 night, I want to remind folks that next Monday night, which is the holiday, February 18th, is District 20 night in Annapolis. It's your chance to go down and meet with your delegates and senator from District 20. And they hold this every year on this same evening on the President's Day holiday, and it's from 6 to 8 p.m. in the House Office Building in Room 170, which is the Montgomery Delegation Room. And I know that a number of members of the council will be going down to that. And if people want to go, they can let the delegation know so that they know how many to prepare for. But they provide some refreshments, and then the legislature goes into session at 8 o'clock on Monday evenings. So it's a chance to talk with your delegates, and if you want to see the legislature in session, it's a very good time to do that. A reminder to my colleagues that next Thursday, the 21st, is the Maryland Municipal League Montgomery chapter meet and confer with County Executive Ike Leggett, and this is our chance to talk with him about his upcoming budget and how that will affect Tacoma Park. And every year, tax duplication is always a subject that is part of that discussion, so we will have an opportunity to question him about how things are on his proposal for the county budget. And finally, I just wanted to let everyone know that I went to a one of the best conferences I've been to in a long time last week. It was the Maryland Mayors Association Conference in Annapolis, and the speaker who we had at the conference was just top-notch, and he is Ed McMahon, who is a resident of Tacoma Park, lives on, I think, Cedar, and he is a senior resident fellow at the Urban Land Institute, and what he talked about was better towns through better planning and design. And he had a room full of 70 people in rapt attention for the 2 hours that he spoke and took questions, and I think everybody in the room felt like we could dispense with the rest of the day's program and just continue talking with Ed McMahon. It was fascinating. And I talked to him about the possibility of potentially coming and speaking to the council or being part of an agenda, doing some kind of program with sharing a lot of the valuable insights and information that he shares all across the country. He's a national expert, and I know he has had some part in the revitalization of Tacoma Junction in the early 80s. He said that his particular part of that project was the murals of the faces in the windows on Grant and Carroll Avenues. He has a lot of good ideas about things that communities all across the country can do, and he said he would be happy to talk with me about arranging something for Tacoma Park. So I just wanted to let people know that that was fascinating, and we have a national expert in our midst who might be willing to share some of his vision with us. We will now move to the city manager's comments.
Thank you. I've got a couple items. The first is tomorrow night at 7:30 p.m. There'll be a meeting about Sligo Mill Overlook Park and the community garden that's there. It's at 7:30 across from the park and garden at 6411 Orchard Avenue. This is to talk about how we can have some play equipment and continue to maintain the successful community garden that's there. People who are involved with either the park neighborhood or the garden are welcome and encouraged to attend. Another item for tomorrow, the County Council will do a couple things. They're scheduled to formally appoint Gary Burnett to the Cable and Communications Advisory Committee as representing Tacoma Park. They're also scheduled to approve funds for this current fiscal year to buy the ride-on buses that are needed to replace the ones that were taken off the streets because they were unsafe, the smaller buses that are better for our smaller streets. I wanted to just announce that we did change the formal title of our 3 police lieutenants to police captains, which is a more appropriate title for the work that they do. It does not change their pay, but it does appropriately correspond with other captains and other adjacent agencies. So we now have a Captain Bowers, Captain Collington, and Captain Frischkorn, which we're pleased with. I also wanted to, on a police matter, I saw the announcement that Corey Moore was found guilty today. He's the Teflon defendant that finally got caught in Tacoma Park, and what an important victory to have that actually be approved and have him off the streets.
That was the instance where he was throwing stuff in a dumpster at the bottom of Sherman Avenue about 2 years ago.
Yeah. Also, just to note that with our new HR staff, we're also getting news up about our vacancies. We have boards around the city building in more prominent places. So if people are looking for jobs, we do have some vacancies, and we encourage you to look there. I do want to mention that in talking about State Highway, we did have a meeting with some State Highway officials today. This may have explained why somebody might have been out measuring something. Is that we have asked for a crosswalk to go from the city lot over to the intersection, the corner at Grant Avenue, and the discussion today with the officials from State Highway was very positive. Looks like that crosswalk may actually be able to move forward. It will require probably some deal with the city about right-of-way at the sidewalk of Grant Avenue, so that the ADA improvements that go with the crosswalk can be installed. And so we're looking at what else involved to expedite that and bring that back to you. That's all.
And so that is potentially an example of the kind of right-of-way change that might be necessary.
That's
that
right.
is being covered in what we're talking about later.
Although noting that the state legislation that we're talking about wouldn't go into effect until October 1st, which is 7.5 months from now, that the SHA has been sitting on our request for a crosswalk for 6 months, there should be no problem for them to get that crosswalk in before any change in state law, regardless what it is, goes into effect, if they wish to.
I was just asking if it was an example of the kind of thing that might be
An
applicable
example
under that.
that if they were playing the way they should be playing would not be an example.
But if it were an example later in a period of time,
If we wish to put in another crosswalk,
it would be applicable.
yes.
Okay, thanks. Any other questions for the city manager? Okay, next up is adoption of minutes. We have one set of minutes from January 7th. Would somebody like to move adoption?
I'll move them with some corrections that I had sent to the city clerk earlier.
Okay. Is there a second?
Second.
Minutes have been moved and seconded. All those approving, please say aye.
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 Ayes have it unanimously. Minutes are adopted. And the next item is the legislative update. Does the acting city manager have any legislative items?
I do have just one, and I put it down in the wrong place here. The city of College Park contacted me today to see if Tacoma Park was planning on taking a position on House Bill 337, which is also Senate Bill 514, which would prohibit fracking, hydraulic fracturing. And so I just raising that as part of your attention, that probably would be something that you would need to have a resolution on, because I don't think we've got something on the record specific to that. So,
And are the hearing dates on that?
I think it is, the Senate one is the 26th of February. The House one is March 8th. So we would have time to put it on, but I wanted to raise it to your attention.
And has College Park taken a position, or are they just...
I think they're going to consider it tomorrow. They were curious about what other municipalities were doing with this.
And my sense had been, this is a bill that would prohibit fracking in the state?
That's correct.
Because what the legislature did last year with the lead sponsorship by Delegate Mazier was to make sure that there was a study which would be something that would protect Maryland from some of the difficulties that happened in Pennsylvania when there wasn't a lot of study and information and a lot of damage taking place, and that the funding for that fracking study was finally added recently, so that my sense was that it was kind of waiting on the outcome of some of that study before going to a point of saying go ahead or do nothing.
Yeah, I'm not sure that this particular bill is what folks have in mind, but I think it certainly is a topic that you may want to discuss.
I'm curious. I know that Delegate Mazier is quite interested in fracking, and she's not listed as one of the
She
sponsors
is not.
on
Only
this.
Delegate Hucker of the District 22, of the District 20 representatives.
Does she have another bill in on this topic?
I don't know. I just got this at like 6 p.m. this evening, so. Laura?
Her legislative aide is here. We could find out.
Yeah, she does. It's a moratorium bill.
What's the number?
1274.
So House
there's-
Bill 1274, we'll look at that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Did you have any other legislative
That's all I
updates? I only have two that I wanted to update people on. These are discussions that took place last week at the MML Legislative Committee. We discussed various bills on open meetings, some of which we kind of talked about as shaming bills. And these are ones that propose that if there's any violation of the Open Meetings Act, that a member of the body would have to get up in a meeting and basically apologize and say why these things happened, and dealing with various fine levels, and there's a number of open meetings law bills in there, and our sense was that HB 331, which is also SB 826, are the likely vehicle for any changes in the open meetings laws. And then the other one is House Bill 587, and that is dealing with reliability standards for vegetation management for electric companies. And the issue that we had with this one was it's proposed to prohibit local governments from passing a law that prevents the electrical utilities from following state or federal laws about vegetation and tree trimming. The Legislative Committee took a position of support with amendment, and because we want to make sure that they wouldn't use this to shut us out of the process of monitoring their work and following designations like historic trees, which have different standards. So at first, it seemed like it was just saying they have to follow what they already have to follow, but the concern was that it would be used to say, well, there are these laws and we have to follow these laws and that's it, and there's nothing else that we have to pay any attention to. And our sense is that there's some variation in what they have to do and differences in how they have to deal with trees, particularly historic trees, rather than just coming through and following the new standards, which are basically to cut back 15 feet horizontally, to go back 15 feet from any electrical transmission wires, or the wires on your street, and then just cut straight up. And in a lot of new areas, that is what the requirements are. So it's wanting to make sure that this isn't a vehicle for allowing electric utilities or other utility contractors from just saying, state and federal law, we're following it, you can't tell us what to do. Any other observations, questions about any legislative areas? Okay, then we will go to our presentation, which is the recommendations of the Small Community Grant Review Committee, and I know that some of those committee members are here.
Hello there. Hi, I'm Leslie Perry. I'm from Ward 2, and I'm representing the Small Community Grant Program Review Committee today. Thank you again for allowing us to reopen the applications. We did award $7,000 already, and this was to award the remaining $3,000 that was left over after our first meeting. And we had a lot more interest than we expected for the second round of applications. We received 8 applications, and so it was a little hard to decide. But they were all great applications. We did decide to fund Tacoma Plays, the full $1,000 that they requested to do community and spring, summer play events at 2 locations. One was the Opal Daniels Park reopening, and also a pool party at the Piney Branch Pool. We also were partial funding for Real Food for Kids Montgomery, which is wanting to improve the food quality at Montgomery County Public Schools through education and improvement in available foods. So then the third thing that we wanted to fund was Historic Tacoma. It's a smaller amount of $500 to make archive records available to the public. This can get them started and go from there. Thank you very much.
I had a question about some of the observations that the committee made about the ones that you did not recommend for approval. And it was to kind of some language about, there were previous funds granted through other city programs, or I had the idea that maybe you were trying to make sure that we addressed some areas that we hadn't addressed previously. Can you just speak about that a little bit?
Sure.
Well,
basically, we wanted to make sure that areas that maybe had received a lot of funding in the past, maybe give that to some other areas. We just kind of thought more along the lines of, if one particular program had received funds in the past and was doing very well, perhaps other ones could get a little more funding and become just as successful.
And so you were looking at it on a program level, where a program got previous funding, or were you looking at an organization?
Organization, not necessarily the particular program.
Because that's why I was wondering, with the last $500 of the requested $2,500, for Historic Tacoma. We've given a good deal of money to them, or made it possible for them to get a number of funds through other proposals, and I just wanted to kind of understand your thinking about that.
Sure. I'm trying to remember a little more detail about that.
Jacqueline Scheck, also on the committee. I don't think we were aware of funding for Historic Tacoma outside of this request. I think we were just totally unaware of any.
Am I right in remembering that there were some other?
A couple of years ago, the city provided, I'm going to say $30,000.
I was going to say 35.
Right, for their building. And that was
for completion of the building.
Exactly, or not completion, but work on the building. And that was several years ago. They've applied for community legacy funding through the city, but I didn't mention this funding to the small grant committee, so it was my. Perhaps I should have mentioned it, but it didn't occur to me because it's been a while.
But that was city funds.
The $30,000 was city funds.
Thanks.
Yes.
I wasn't sure either. I wanted to make sure. Other questions, Councilmember Mayo?
Thank you, Mayor. This question is a little bit seeming from right field. We have a large grant program in the city, and I'm just curious. This is sort of a hypothetical, but is it possible that if some criteria were established, that the small grant committee could equally play a role for us in making recommendations on large grants?
I've served on both committees, and it seems that the large grants are block grants, and
that's a different.
Oh, that's a different.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So, but it'd be considered differently.
Yeah, mostly I'm just asking, could you handle more work with one committee?
Well, considering there are two of us here tonight, so we'd have to take that back to the committee.
Sure. Thank you.
Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. My question is, why didn't Educare get any funding?
We had considered them in the first round of applications, and we had not given, at that time, they had some rollover funds from the previous year that they hadn't used and were going to be using this year. So they are receiving funds this year from the city.
Okay. And how do you look at if an organization has put in an application for a large grant and a small grant? Do you guys consider that?
I think that should be discouraged. There has been some overlapping in requests of funds historically in the few years that I've been involved with the two programs, the block grants and the small community grants. We had, in the first go-round of the small grants, we had people asking for large amounts and then rewriting for other size. I mean, it gets very confusing. And I think when we see somebody going from one program to another program, one type of application to another type of application, I think the group tends to take a more negative view. And so I think organizations should decide what they're looking for, pick a program and apply for it. And if they get it, well, great. And if they don't, well, we're sorry. But I think it gets very confusing when you see the same name popping up for different amounts of money. I think that gets very confusing to the reviewers.
Do the executive directors of these organizations come to the committee and talk to you about their programs?
No. We review their applications as they stand and on their own merits as we, as citizens, look at them and try and put our group thoughts together. We don't hear from the applicants themselves, and that's probably a good thing.
It's a good thing that you don't, or
that we don't. I think it makes us. We've had, historically speaking, we've had people who presented really terrible applications. And then they came back and another year with far improved. So their skills as writing grant applications and requests for money, actually, they took to heart some of the comments that had been made by the committees and improved their applications, honed them a little bit more, made more better sense of their budgets and so forth.
Thank you.
If I can get some clarification, do I recall correctly that the seniors and those who care for them applied for the large grant process and the small grant? Okay. Yes.
Some of the representatives of that group and I will meet with this acting city manager Ludlow on Thursday morning, I think, to discuss that. And this is to that point. I and some of the other council members will join me in meeting with Educare on Wednesday afternoon. Cheer, and I know some of you have met with Cheer already to clarify their large grant, and I think that maybe especially with the large grants, it's important to have that dialogue and understand in particular what Ms. Schick was referring to, that sometimes the application doesn't portray the program well.
Okay. Yeah, because I've met with the seniors and those who care for them and
right
and Cheer.
I think the top question that comes up in this review often, in all these reviews, is what is it they're going to spend the money on? You get sometimes it gets mixed into the mission statement, and the specific project sometimes isn't as clearly stated as. I'm not saying either of these groups fell fault in that, although I think they might have. But it does sometimes, and these are very carefully read by the members, and we go over and flip-flop back and forth with sentence by sentence. So, I mean, sometimes it's really hard to figure out just what it is that they're going to spend the money on. And that might, if you're going to meet with such people, that might be nice to...
Right. Councilmember Mayo.
The reason for my question about the large grants is partly because I'm concerned that we don't have enough distance from the process of deciding on large grants. And that distance, I think, is an important thing because there's clear opportunities for patronage and conflict of interest. Almost everyone involved in every one of these proposals is a voter, often a very active member of the community. And I just see that as a risk. It feels uncomfortable to me to look at proposals and not have the shield of a committee which is making maybe less partial decisions. At least that's a different weighting factor. And so I very much appreciate the work you all do. We still can override your recommendations, and I think that's a fine thing. But it makes it's extremely helpful to have your advice coming in from the outside and your view of these proposals in a somewhat more neutral frame. Thank you.
Yeah,
and it also seems that there's been some overlap this year, with applications coming from that process to this. This is my first year on the committee, but, it seems like that's something that will probably happen more frequently than it will less frequently.
Yeah, and if I can just say that I think both processes are evolving. Mm-hmm. We haven't been doing them for that many years, so that we've been kind of changing how we look at them, and as more people realize that we've been doing this, then there are more applications, there are more people working on it, more ideas, and the large grant process has evolved somewhat. It started out as, well, gee, there are these pieces of money that the city is giving to other organizations that are kind of budget decisions, and as we go into the budget, wanting to understand what those are and what the process is for them, so it's not just kind of the tail end of a process where, well, we've always done it that way, or it's because somebody did it and we know who that is, and we know what they do. It's like, but we need to open this up for other people who don't necessarily know the process, know the people, to keep it a more open and transparent process.
I think one thing that if you're going to add any rules to the application process and what have you, is that there should, I can't remember offhand whether there is or isn't, but there should be very firmly that people can only come to the well so often. So I've been a few rounds, and many of the names are the same. And, you know, at some point, self-sufficiency, I think, needs to come about in these organizations. They can't be totally dependent on grants from the city to do such things year after year. I mean, it's,
And some of the large grant ones are entities that have lots of other sources of funds, but the city contributes something toward them, and they tend to be things that people always associate with the city and think of as city functions, like the Folk Festival or the 4th of July celebration.
yes.
Councilmember Grimes.
Thank you. I want to note that in certain cases, city representatives have suggested to grant applicants that they roll over their application from one program to another, so just consider that. But I think that what Councilmember Mail had to say, and what I think I heard the mayor amplifying about having, if not your committee, a committee like yours, review the large grant applications as well, seems sensible. I know that the Montgomery County Council and County Executive employ a committee of residents to review their large grant applications. And I'll also mention, I said a few minutes ago about some meetings that I have. There's one other that I'm going to meet with the EDG to learn more about what they're doing. In a couple of those cases, not including EDG, part of what I hope to assess is the organization's capacity to manage, to administer the large sum of money, relatively large sum of money. It's not so much a concern for a few $100s or maybe even a couple of thousand, but when we're talking tens of thousands, that becomes much more of a concern. And I did participate in one meeting with a number of community members, and city staff member Roz Grigsby, who's here, will participate in that as well, to talk about ways to have community funding of businesses and so on. And one item that we discussed in a meeting a week and a half ago was the need for certain organizations, especially startup businesses, but also nonprofit organizations, to receive not only financial assistance, but also technical assistance. Regarding the small grant award recommendations in front of us, I would happily support the recommendations that you have brought to us, including, despite your not knowing about earlier city funding for Historic Tacoma, the amount that you have put in for Historic Tacoma, because I am familiar with the work that they are doing with the archives, and I think that this is appropriate. Thank you.
Councilmember Schultz.
I think you've been doing fine work. I wanted to make sure you know that I appreciate what you're doing, and the difficulty in making these decisions. I mean, you know, these are so small, such small amounts of money that, you know, it's difficult, because if you can't give any money at all to an organization, that's kind of difficult. At least with the large grants, you can sort of say, well, we're not going to give you $25,000, we'll only give you $17,000, and at least they have something. But when you're down at this level, I think it even gets more difficult because of the small amounts of money. I'm curious about one idea, and that is that we spend a lot of time making these selections, and then we grant them the money, and they're required to spend it within a certain period of time. But I don't think we really get any feedback as to if they actually did, and so sometimes you sort of think, well, this particular proposal, let's say, seems so exciting and interesting, but you know, we disperse the funds and don't really know how it worked out. And do you think it makes any sense? Because I realize these are small amounts of money, and I don't want to create administrative work, you know, like having to go back and make these people do all kinds of filing reports and all that, or having anybody on our end having to to deal with it, but is there some way we can get some sort of feedback as to, in your opinion, this is an open question, I don't have any preconceived ideas about it.
Let me
First, the small grants are a reimbursement, as I understand it, that they get the money after they've done the work. So it reimburses for expenditures they've made.
All right.
So I assume that they don't, that they prove to you that they've done the work before they get the check.
I was going to turn to the city clerk, who has, I think, overseen these small grants, and if you can just give us a quick sense of the process that's used, because I think it addresses both some comments by Councilmember Grimes and Councilmember Schultz.
Sure. The what we do is put together a little agreement that goes out to the groups that have received funding. There's an agreement that explains that they need to complete the work by June 30th, that they need to request reimbursement by July 15th. We offer the opportunity to pay vendors directly in case there's a situation where they're not able to put out the money in advance. But we require them to provide receipts, proof of paid invoices. They have to document all the money that they spend. Frankly, sometimes they don't always end up using it all. And some of it just rolls back into the general fund. We also have written into the agreement that they have to provide a narrative report of the project. And so I actually do have them. I've not done a very good job of distributing them, but we do request that report back from them.
So they don't just get to get the money and do
No,
whatever they want. They have pretty stringent requirements.
Right. Our finance office is very stringent as to what they will release funds for, and so we do provide all that backup before they get the money.
Thanks.
It would be nice, I think, if the participants were invited to a council meeting to make a short presentation of what they accomplished. I've often told Jesse that I think there should be a requirement that the city is acknowledged in a formal way, signage, use of logo or whatever, to show that they did receive some sort of support from the city in their project. And it's always good to put your name out there that you supported it. A presentation of a few words about the project after its completion here at a council meeting, just as we have a presentation of our recommendations, might be welcome for these people, that they get a chance to publicly let everybody know what they've done.
Good. Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. I think this has been a healthy discussion. I think it's off topic for what our purpose is tonight, but I think it suggests that maybe a council discussion on the grant process is again in order at some point. Because I'm not even sure if for the small grant process that city council grants are the best way for the city to handle it, or for the nonprofit organizations. It may be better for the city to take another step that would let the taxpayers themselves decide what they want to support, and at the same time maybe the city can help make this selection process easier for people by somehow vetting the various organizations. But again, I think that's beyond tonight's discussion, so I'll stop. Thank you.
Okay.
And thank you for your work.
Do we have any other questions or discussion on the presentation and recommendations? Thank you both very much, and thank all the committee members. Okay, so we will bring those back, I believe, next week. All right. We have a couple of regular meeting agenda items. Did you have something?
When you get to the next agenda item.
Oh, okay.
I have something to say.
The second item on our agenda is the second reading ordinance amending the Tacoma Park Code, Chapter 5.08, about redistricting. We have had numerous discussions about this, numerous presentations. We had first reading, I think, 2 weeks ago, and I believe you have something additional for us on this. There's a small change.
Yes. So the city attorney recommends a minor change to this ordinance, that you amend the ordinance at second reading, and that would be to make it effective immediately rather than, as we had originally stated, to have it, to say it would be effective for the election of November 5th, 2013. The reason for that is it just makes it a little more clear. That it just seemed a bit fuzzy the way it was stated before, and in fact, Councilmember Grimes had asked the question, well, does it apply to the nominating caucus? Well, of course it does, but none of it was very clear in the ordinance. So she just recommended that you make it effective immediately. The other thing, though, that we wanted to clarify is that for residents who are being redistricted, there would be no change in who represents them now. Of course, that those residents would continue to be represented by the council member they elected, and there would be no change until the new council member is elected and sworn in. Just to be clear about that, get that on the record.
And that would have to be explicitly stated if we change it to effective immediately?
Does it have to be explicitly stated? Oh, yes. One of the things that we had talked about is once this is finalized, staff would be sending a letter to every resident who is being redistricted, every voter who is being redistricted, so that we could make clear to them this situation, so that they're continuing to be represented by their council member, but at the point of the next election, they'll be represented by the council member who is elected. The other, so let me make one more point, and that is that by making it effective immediately for any council member who might be, or not council member, but candidate who might be in a different ward after the election, their clock for residency could start to run now.
Because they have to live in the ward for...
Right, so we would just use, right, so
Period
there
of
wouldn't
time.
be any confusion about
What's
when their
the period
residency.
of time for the
6
residency?
months.
6 months.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Councilmember Grimes, you have a question?
I'd suggest that if you send a letter to people who are redistricted, it be restricted not to voters but to all residents, because the council members represent everyone, whether the person is a voter or not.
Good point, yes.
Okay, would somebody like to introduce the ordinance?
I'll move it.
Is there a second?
I'll second it.
Okay.
Moving as amended?
Certainly.
It's been moved and seconded as amended. Councilmember Mayo.
Thank you. Could the city clerk just clarify that? So if a candidate who, let's say Ward 2, Ward 2 is not gaining anyone, someone who lives in the former part of Ward 2 that's being moved into Ward 6, if someone there wanted to run for the Ward 6 seat, they could not do so in November 20 of this year.
They could do so.
Could do so.
Their clock would start to run now. They would be as if they lived in...
I got it, okay.
For that purpose, as if they lived in Ward 6 now.
Okay, great.
Yes.
Thank you.
Councilmember Schultz.
Yeah, I'm glad this is being clarified. At least I think it's being clarified.
Oops.
Because I've been, knowing that I'm going to inherit some new constituents,
If you're reelected.
as Councilmember Grimes adds, if I'm reelected, which you didn't have to say that, but
My pleasure.
it was concerning me that when do I sort of say to them, hey, you're in my ward now. And I guess what this is saying is that I can't say that until I get reelected.
You could campaign there, of course.
Well,
The
yeah.
assumption is that if you were running for office, you
I
would be
could start
campaigning.
campaigning now, actually.
You could.
Right, okay.
And then it would be like a national election.
But thank you, I'm clear.
Okay. Any further council comment? Is there any public comment on this second reading ordinance amending the Tacoma Park Code for redistricting? Mr. Lovelace in the back.
Hi, my name's Pat Lovelace, 7620 Maple Avenue, your official peace delegate. Got a couple of questions on that. One is when they have the elections up, are they going to be voting for, like they're in a different ward? But the question I have about that is you guys have got to get the information on that out. Like, because a lot of people don't watch, some people don't watch our channel on TV or the internet. They may not even know about it, but I think it should be out on the regular news and also on the regular newspapers, you know, like the Gazette, the Voice, and other papers like that. Maybe even the Post have a small thing in it. And also I think we should be putting it out on the regular news channels so that we can educate the people as much as possible on it. And another thing, too, is I hope you guys are taking into account what a lot of the senior citizens are not going to be able to take into account. I want to keep my Councilman Terry Siemens in Ward 4 because he's a really good councilman. He's really done a lot for us. It'd be really tragic if you redistricted him to another district because next year in the vote, I hope he runs again because if he does, we're going to keep him, and I'd like to stay in this ward anyway, Ward 4, because I don't want to see anything, any of those big changes. And the main thing is other people may feel the same way. So the idea of making it effective immediately, I think, is a good idea, because they should be able to know who they're voting for. You know, before they move to the other ward, because when they move to the other ward, if there's no information given out about this, they're going to not know what the heck they're doing, especially the senior citizens, who's, some of them are slow in memory and they confuse easy, but they're also good voters. And I'd like to see us get all the information out on the TVs, the networks, the regular newspapers like the Post, the Gazette, and the Voice, and everything else. I'd like to see a lot of the information put out in the media so we can educate everybody on this. Thank you very much, and I hope to keep you, Terry Siemens and Joyce. I hope we keep you people up for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think the effort to mail something to everybody who's been affected by the change should go a long way toward making sure that they know that that's been changed in a timely fashion. Is there any other public comment? Seeing none, this is a second reading ordinance that'll require a roll call vote. And if I could ask the clerk to call a roll from the bottom instead of the top. Mix you up.
You'll confuse me.
Yes.
Okay. Yes, I can read. I can read up the list. Councilmember Smith.
Yay.
Councilmember Siemens.
Here. I'm sorry.
You got it.
See, you can't do it, Houston.
We're voting on this agenda.
Councilmember Schultz.
Aye.
Councilmember Mayo.
Aye.
Councilmember Grimes.
Aye.
Councilmember Daniels Cohen. Mayor Williams.
Aye. That passes unanimously. The next item is a second reading ordinance authorizing a FY13 budget amendment number 2. That's for the current year. So does the acting city manager want to go through this real quick?
And get to it.
And
This
again,
is the second reading ordinance. It has a couple really fairly routine changes that I explained when this first came on January 28th. The one thing that I did note at the time, but is now reflected in the language, is that I had transposed account numbers related to election expenses, and those have been corrected for second reading.
Okay. Would somebody like to move this ordinance?
So moved.
And second?
Second.
Moved by Councilmember Smith, seconded by Councilmember Grimes. Are there any council comments on this second reading ordinance regarding the budget amendment? Seeing none, is there any public comment on this budget amendment? Seeing none, it's a second reading ordinance. Will the clerk please call the roll from the top?
Mayor Williams.
Aye.
Councilmember Daniels Cohen. Councilmember Grimes.
Aye.
Councilmember Mayo.
Aye.
Councilmember Schultz.
Aye.
Councilmember Siemens.
Aye.
Councilmember Smith.
That passes unanimously. The next agenda item is a consent agenda. There are 3 items on it: a resolution extending the food truck pilot program, a resolution providing for appointments to the Arts and Humanities Commission, and one appointing people to the Personnel Appeals Board. Would somebody like to move the consent agenda?
Moved. Second.
Moved by Councilmember Grimes, seconded by Councilmember Schultz. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it unanimously. We will take a short break, and we will come back for our discussion of the MOU agreement for contributions on 6530 New Hampshire Avenue.
Also, item 5.
And we will take up the first work session item, which is a discussion of a proposed MOA, Memorandum of Agreement, for a contribution to a feasibility study for 6530 New Hampshire Avenue. Ms. Grigsby.
Grigsby, Community Development Coordinator for the city. What we have before us tonight is a discussion about 6530 New Hampshire Avenue. It's a problematic property. It's long been vacant. It's had a succession of owners in the last 10 years. It is in fairly poor condition. And in the last 4 or 5 months, there's been a coalescence of a working group of people interested in that property. I'm joined tonight by Jorge Ramirez, who's the Vice President for the Potomac Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists. They own the building. And Ethan Landis of Landis Construction. The feasibility proposal that you have in front of you is from Ethan. So we wanted to talk a little bit about the plans and ideas we have for the building and engage the council in a conversation about the possibility of partnership between the city and the Potomac Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists. The working group includes the Potomac Conference and a representative of ECDC Enterprise Group, which is a 501c3 that does micro-funding for local and a broad range of business supports for local businesses, as well as city staff and city council member. And the idea has come together of finding the common ground between the property owner and city staff and local business interests on New Hampshire Avenue. And it's taken the shape of a business incubator. The idea of a business incubator is essentially a place for business development. It includes education supports, the professional networking, shared space, so it lowers the costs of startup businesses, and peer learning elements. It's a chance for businesses to really get on solid footing and then expand out from there. So it is, in fact, an incubator that gets them started and sends them out into the world. And in the process of these conversations, we had a walkthrough of 6530 New Hampshire Avenue with the local Adventist pastor. It's now owned by a local congregation. And so part of the group saw the interior of the space, and Ethan Landis was part of that walkthrough to sort of flesh out what it would take to actually go to the next step, have some idea of a roadmap that would move it forward. Why does this matter to the city? The city's put an enormous amount of energy into the New Hampshire Avenue corridor in the last 5-6 years. This is a long-standing problematic property, even a blighted property. This is an opportunity to start some of the ripple effects that we see when a property visibly turns around and an active, vibrant project takes hold there, that it becomes a transformative effect on the nearby properties and gains momentum down the commercial corridor. And so this is an opportunity to move that forward. It's an interesting location. It is across the street from the Tacoma substation. It backs up to the Montgomery County Park held land there. As you recall, there was a house on Sligo Mill Road which was demolished about 6 months ago when the county took it over and absorbed that into one whole parcel back there. So that will remain as a part. On the map in your one-page handout, Sligo Mill Road, the county believes that it actually goes much further than it does. It actually stops at this property, at 6530 New Hampshire at this point. It's actually chained off at that point. So I think with that...
I'm sorry, you said it's chained off at that point, but the right-of-way extends further?
I think the county got the road with the property as part of the absorption into their park there, but I don't know that for sure. I can check on the right-of-way.
Yeah, I think the right-of-way... The right-of-way was part of the townhouse development, so it was identified as part of the townhouse development, and that is something that I believe kind of expired because the townhouse development did not go through. Whether we need to actually do the process to officially close the road or not is something we need to look into.
I think it's important because I think that could be an important addition to the property in question if we were to actually still have that right away and be able to abandon it to the 6530 address.
Yeah, we have to look at the provisions for the park. And
Right.
that would be part of what we look at.
I think it's important.
We can check on that. So if there aren't further questions, I would like to ask Ethan Landis to go ahead. He has some slides, including some interior photos, so it'll give you a better idea of the current state of the property and his proposal for feasibility. You want to go from that? Yeah, let's do that.
Good evening. So we have several photographs we put together here, as well as a couple other drawings that would maybe be helpful for you to imagine what the end product or part of the end product of this project would be. We could start to scroll through here. So we have a couple exterior photographs. Many of you will recognize these, and we could keep going through them. These are taken recently in the last month or so. And then we have several photographs on the interior. The main staircase that goes up through the space is actually in very good condition. It would need to be modified to make it code compliant, but it still could remain a very nice architectural feature of the space.
Is there an elevator in the building?
There is not. That would be part of our project, is to design an elevator with an additional stair core. There's a good deal of demolition has occurred in the building. It's largely gutted out, but there's still a lot of plumbing, and the core structure, the steel, the Q-deck, the roofing, all looks like it's in reasonably good shape. A lot of the windows are boarded up, but there also is a good deal of light in the building, and I think that could be improved with the redesign. So now what we're going to show you is just a couple quick slides from another project that has some similarities to this that we're actually in the final stages of designing. So another building happens to be in Washington, D.C., but just to give you an idea of what the finished schematic drawings would look like to help people visualize the final project, and it would constitute great marketing materials for helping raise money for the project as needed, and helping the community recognize what its potential would be as an incubator. So again, this is a different building, of course, but this is the kind of drawings that we would produce with 3D perspectives, being able to see interior walls and how furniture layouts would work, whether it's temporary movable office structures or more permanent spaces where all the bathrooms would be, the kitchens, the stair cores, the new elevator, showing where all the windows would be. And then as part of this, we've also included a LEED scorecard so we could show how it would be produced as a LEED silver or LEED gold project. Another part of this effort would be we would produce a 1- and 3-year financial pro forma showing all the square footage that would be leasable in the building and what the general revenue with a vacancy rate would be, along with all the expected operating expenses for a business like this, effectively, as well as how many parking spaces it would have, and what the expected utility costs would be, and so forth, to be able to help the groups that are involved with this project understand how it would ideally be very sustainable over the coming years. With that, do we have any more slides? Is that it? Good. So if there's any questions, happy to answer them.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you for coming tonight. First, to let you know, I'm principal in Skipjack Real Estate, and we have attempted to sell the building a couple of times. I don't know if Mr. Landis remembers that we thought we had some hot prospects a couple times. But anyways, I know, as you said, the building's been gutted, essentially, and is the plumbing, do you think, still viable, or?
That would be a part of our project in here, is to have a closer analysis of what's salvageable and what's not, depending on where the bathroom core, if it ends up going back in that same location. My guess is we could definitely reuse a fair amount of the plumbing, but all the copper's gone, all the electrical wiring is gone, the HVAC equipment.
No sprinkler system?
Yeah, there was no brick. I don't believe there was one in here, but obviously that would be designed into the new project.
And the HVAC's gone?
All gone.
Yeah. I know that you mentioned using it as an incubator. Is that a definite at this point, that that's a kind of a target use of the building, or is that just that's just one of the potentials that this space could be used for? Right.
You know, it would definitely be part of the conversation over the coming weeks and months first month of the project. Mm-hmm. I think between the church and between the Tacoma Park, that this seems like it's a good business model that would be versatile. It would provide something that the community needs, and it would be a viable, sustainable space for multiple uses within its zoning.
Because I know one of the nice things about the building is it does have large open spaces in there that might be attractive to some other business entities. I know that one of the customers who was looking at it, one of my clients, was envisioning a bump out on the back for the elevator core and restrooms, so it would preserve the large open space and also limit the plumbing and the elevator to a new addition that would be on the back of the building. So I just mentioned that for what it's worth. I thank you
Great.
for your bringing this forward.
Appreciate that.
Councilmember Smith.
Thank you. What's the estimated cost for construction and FF&E for this project to be completed?
That would definitely be one of our deliverables on this project.
What's the estimated timeline?
Well, the project that we've proposed here would take us every bit of 2 months to do, possibly a little bit more depending on the amount of involvement between the different interested parties, but ideally 60 to 75 days.
So why a incubator? I mean,
That's good.
I didn't mean to put Ethan on the spot. We had asked him to give us a feasibility proposal for an incubator. He wasn't really part of the conversation that got us to that point. What we had was a convergence of interests. The property had reverted to the Potomac Conference in early summer, at about the same time that a couple people came to me saying, what about an incubator? And so we sort of got everybody to the table at once, and it was an idea that seemed to be common ground between the interests of the Potomac Conference, the interests of the city, and the interests of some of the other folks that were
has
at
the
the
city
table.
polled any of the businesses on New Hampshire University and see if they would use an incubator?
No, and they aren't actually the target users for an incubator. It's for startups and new businesses primarily. So it might be for people who have a business in their spare bedroom that they are moving out to the next step, but largely it's not intended for existing businesses. It's really to give a foot up to people who are just beginning.
So how are you going to find these people?
I think there are all kinds of ways to find them. Certainly we'll work through the Tacoma Langley Crossroads CDA, and we'll probably do some outreach to I'm blanking on the name, the Prince George's Neighborhood Initiative.
Because there's the incubator in downtown Silver Spring. How successful is that one?
I don't know.
Okay. Mr. Landis, you gave us an example of a building that you did in D.C. How much did it cost?
Well, this is actually just in the same feasibility study phase. It's actually just done with the feasibility study phase right now. And it's a school environment where they know exactly what they want to do with it, although it has multiple uses in it. So it's not an ideal model for telling you exactly what's happened all the way through.
What's a ballpark?
What's a ballpark? Like on the square foot cost?
No.
Or?
The cost of how many square feet is that building that you guys are doing in D.C.?
It's about 40,000 square feet of build out.
Okay. And what's the per square foot cost to make those improvements that you're doing the building in D.C.?
Right. It's a very different animal because it's going to need that building already has HVAC and electrical and windows and everything built out into it. So it's much more of a tenant fit out. This is going to be a remodeling and adding to the shell and core, and, new elevators, a lot of other parts to it. So it's a little bit apples to oranges on that, but it could be, $150 to $200 a square foot minimum, and then landscaping and stormwater management, depending on, again, we have a pretty good sense of the building, but there's a lot of aspects to it of how to reskin it, what kind of windows we use, does it need a new roof, or does it have to just be repaired? There'll be a lot of parts to it.
So is it too much to say that this would be a $5 million project?
It might be too soon to say.
Well, because this is my question. We're going to you want the city to invest $14,000, right? But what does that mean? Does that mean we're going to invest $14,000 and you're going to come back and say that this is a $5 million project? We don't know how we're going to get the $5 million to make this project become a reality? I mean, we should know before we start how much this is going to cost.
Did you want to? I was just going to say we can't know before we do anything how much this is going to cost. This is a very first step to figure that out.
But there's
But it's also not a city project.
It's not a city project.
Pastor Ramirez, are you going to address the council?
Yeah. Do you want to? Yeah, come on up.
Because perhaps you could answer some questions that I think my colleague was getting at about how the overall project would be financed.
Good evening. The Potomac Conference realizes that when we first acquired this property, the intent obviously was for one of our congregations to make that a church. And we've worked with our local congregation, Langley Park Spanish Seventh-day Adventist Church. And unfortunately, because of economics and many other issues, they were not able to turn that building into a church. They tried in many ways to make that happen, but after many months and years of trying to successfully accomplish that, the executive committee of the Potomac Conference decided, we are going to take the building into our hands. We're going to pretty much take effective control of the building. And so what are our options? And so this is what's bringing us to this discussion. We feel that, having a building the way it is it's not a good thing for the city of Tacoma Park. And so we are exploring, we're looking at any possibilities of how can we turn that building into a performing asset. And so right now, I don't think we, even as a conference, we have all of the options. The answers on how we can make that happen. We're beginning to explore them. We want ultimately to make that possible. We own the building, and we want to be responsible to the city of Tacoma Park. And so, at this point, we have assets that we could eventually, if it comes to that point, consider selling to be able to finance, whatever business venue we end up engaging with. I think this is why the feasibility study is so important, because it should give us a better understanding of what we're looking at. At this point, I don't think we ourselves have any answers as to how much it's going to cost. We feel we should have the finances to be able to contribute to this business venture. So that's where we are at this point from the church perspective.
So are you saying in your internal discussions, you guys don't have a number that says that you're going to walk away from this project?
We have not looked at a hard number at this point. We're looking at a feasibility study. We're looking at whatever options that study may give us, and so at that point, I believe we can go to the drawing table and begin to see how we can accomplish potentially something that could hopefully turn that building into a performing asset for the city of Tacoma Park.
So if it costs $2 million to bring this project to fruition, is that something you're willing to go forward with?
I think if we can have some kind of partnership with the city of Tacoma Park, and by that I'm not throwing numbers at all or percentages of any kind. Just what can the city of Tacoma Park do to assist the Potomac Conference in making that building again a performing asset, something that is going to again bring perhaps some added beauty to New Hampshire Avenue. Right now, we all know what the building looks like, and we take responsibility as a corporation for perhaps letting this drag as long as it has drag. But I think at this point we're saying enough is enough. we have to make something happen. We cannot just ignore that, and we're willing to explore any possibilities available to hopefully turn that into a performing asset.
One last question. If the council doesn't give you the money for the feasibility study, will you go ahead and do a feasibility study on your own?
That would be something that our executive committee would have to make a decision. I think we as officers of the corporation, we feel, again, that we could probably recommend that. But again, it's up to our executive committee to make that decision. We have to look at all of our options at this point, and that would be certainly one of those.
Thank you, sir.
Councilmember Grimes.
Thank you. Pastor Ramirez, it appears that the Potomac Conference is one of 8 conferences within the Columbia Union. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, can you repeat
The
that?
Potomac
again?
Conference is one of 8 conferences within the Columbia Union.
Yes.
And according to the website here, the conference operates a well-known Adventist Community Services Center in Silver Spring, Maryland. Is that the one on Sligo Avenue?
Yes, that is it's a church entity, but that is under the Columbia Union Conference of Seventh-day Adventists. It does not. It's not part of the. It's not one of the ministers of the Potomac Conference, but
Okay.
it is within the church. But it's under the Columbia Union Conference.
So in financial terms, the Potomac Conference has a non-performing asset here, and it presumably has carrying costs associated with it. Has the Potomac Mr. Landis described and showed us a project that is similar, a feasibility project, but I wondered, has the Potomac Conference ever conducted a project of this nature that is not building or rehabilitating a building for a church, but rather for commercial purposes, business purposes?
I believe the answer is no. I think this would be a first-time kind of a venture.
So the financing situation then would also be one that the Potomac Conference doesn't have any experience with?
Not with this type of model.
This is probably a question for Ms. Grigsby. Because I've read state code regarding property taxes in relationship to a different project that would be undertaken by a church locally, it appears in state property tax code that a church-owned property that is not used for the church mission would be subject to property taxes. My inference is that this would not be a property used for the church mission. Therefore, it would be subject to property taxes.
That's our understanding.
So we would, by promoting this project, if it goes through, we would create jobs and add to the vitality of New Hampshire Avenue, and we would also create property tax revenues for the city and the county, our friends at the county. Have you, Pastor Ramirez, had any discussions with Montgomery County? I know, for instance, that an institution just up with New Hampshire Avenue, Educare, which we're very interested in, recently had a visit from County Executive Ike Leggett. I know that the county executive as well as the Prince George's County executive are very interested in the Tacoma-Langley Crossroads area. Have there been any discussions with Montgomery County as well, which has much deeper pockets than us, even though their financial situation is probably more strained than ours?
At this point, the answer would be no. We have not had those discussions. However, if I may add one more thing, we're here to ask the city council to consider that possibility of partnering with us with this feasibility study. I realize there's $14,000 involved. However, we as a Potomac Conference, we're willing to say to you tonight that if you invest in this feasibility study, and for whatever reason, the Potomac Conference decides down the road to go in a different direction with the building, we're here to say to you we're willing to reimburse 50% of your investments. Again, because we understand that it is just one of those things that the city of Tacoma Park should not be held totally responsible
I
But,
definitely appreciate that.
We
Thank
were
you.
trying to find ways to partner and make this happen if it's possible.
Right. Ms. Grigsby, have you or has anyone run the zoning change by the planning board or anyone on the county council? Or just from experience, do you expect it would go smoothly?
I've been in conversation with county staff about the zoning and the zoning rewrite. I assume that's what you mean?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it could be handled in the near term via a zoning text amendment, or it could be handled in the zoning rewrite. You'd know more about the timing of that than I do.
I don't know
You probably know.
when it-
Even if you don't know, you know more than
when
I
it
do.
kicks in, and I wouldn't want to commit to that if I did know. But I don't have an answer. The way it's zoned right now, the office medium use will kick over into the EOF, employment of office, and it has some constraints which I think we would prefer not to have. So if it went into a CR zone in the new zoning code, that would give us more flexibility.
Is it? I see there's another OM zone up New Hampshire Avenue, but the rest of it is C2.
It is.
C2 would roll over into CR?
Yes. So it would be commercial residential. It would allow mixed use in those spaces. The EOF also would allow mixed use in a more limited scale.
My question is becoming, CR versus EOF. You think this is advantageous to
We are
pursue the
pursuing
EOF?
conversations. I don't have answers yet.
Could this
We've been
project be
working-
done if it were zoned to the equivalent of a C2, the CR namely?
Yes.
Okay, so that's not an impediment there. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Mr. Landis, I'm curious on your proposal letter. On the middle of the second page, there's an exclusion. Our scope does not include mechanical, electrical, plumbing, civil or structural engineering, analysis, or design work. Okay, I guess this isn't a wood frame building, so you're not going to find termites, but what if you found the equivalent of that? What if the equivalent of that existed? This is a business feasibility study relating to physical aspects that would support this kind of business. How do we know that the structure can be rehabilitated for this purpose?
This is excluding the engineering that gets us to a permittable project. However, and especially with the drawings that have been produced for a previous design project on here, we actually do have a good deal of information about the infrastructure, the size of the water service coming in, and the electrical capacity, at least the conduits coming in. But part of this would be reviewing how much electricity, for example, the building would need under its revised purpose, and is that easy to get, or is that going to be hard? We would be looking at that infrastructure.
Okay. I think that's all my questions.
Go ahead.
Please.
I just wanted to add a point of clarification in the partnership that we're proposing. We don't have any draft language for a memo of agreement in front of you tonight. We wanted to get feedback from council first before we proceeded with that. But the conversations we've had about partnership include a couple of things. One is the possibility of sharing costs for the feasibility study, so we have a starting point and we know what next steps look like. The other is that the city has the capacity to possibly tap into grant funds as a municipality that a nonprofit or a private corporation would not be able to, especially with the LEED certification, the opportunity to make this a model of some kind to show what the rehab work that can be done in an old building in poor condition to brought up to possibly gold certified LEED standard is of interest to all kinds of folks, especially at the state level and possibly even federal funds for exactly this kind of work. So in our previous discussions, the idea of partnership is that we all bring different things to the table. So this conversation tonight is about moving the feasibility study forward, but I don't want you to walk away from here thinking that at any point the working group expects to be standing in front of council saying, and it's a $5 million project, are you in for half? That has not been anywhere part of our discussions. What the city can offer through city staff's work is the possibility of doing the research on what grant funding might be available and under the city's status as a municipality, possibly forwarding an application. That would also come before you for your approval first.
Okay, maybe just one more question. Pastor Ramirez, does the Potomac Conference own the building and the land free and clear, or do you have some kind of mortgage on it?
There is a loan that it's payable to Columbia Union. The Potomac Conference is currently making payments on that mortgage since the church was not able to make the payments. So right now, we continue to make those payments, and we would make the payments till the building would be paid.
So the note is held by Columbia Union, but it's within another branch of the church.
Correct.
Or parent organization.
Correct.
All right, thank you very
That would
much.
be a parent organization.
Thank you.
And let me just add before going to Councilmember Schultz that I appreciate your offer to consider rebating our half if it ends up being all the type of activity in something that would not return us any of the potential tax revenues on our investment in taking some step like this. So that was a concern I had, and I appreciated hearing that.
And I do have a letter which I'll give to her, and so it's in writing.
Very good. Thank you. Councilmember Schultz.
I just wanted to, for the record, explain my role in this so that there's no confusion. I have the EC. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You are saddled with so many responsibilities. The ECDC Enterprise Development Group is an organization that does microenterprise lending. It's a 501c3 in Arlington, Virginia, and I'm on the board of that organization. I've been a volunteer with it since it was organized in 1991, so over 20 years. And I was responsible for, by virtue of wearing that hat, of encouraging the Enterprise Development Group to open an office here in Tacoma Park to bring to get its microenterprise lending more proximate to this particular population over here. And that's happened, and they are functioning in that capacity. But I also knew that they run an incubator in Arlington, in their office building in Arlington. They've had it for a number of years. I think it has something like 17 tenants in it. So they have experience with it. And I knew that they were possibly interested in doing something like that on this side of the Potomac River. So putting all that together and seeing the building that we know has been a problematic building, as it's been characterized, and realizing the developmental challenges of making that a viable asset for whoever might own it, it occurred to me that we might be able to get something to work here. And that's when I approached Ms. Grigsby about this idea. And we started talking about the possibility of it. And that was almost a year ago. A phone call was made to the Potomac Conference down in Stanton, Virginia. And lo and behold, we found by sheer timing, luck, that you were in the throes of finding out that the church that you had that you had sold it to was not able to make the payments, and in effect you were going to be taking back that asset and back under your control. And so that was just a serendipitous kind of a circumstance. So I've had a role in this whole process, sort of wearing two hats, as a city council member and as a board member of the ECDC Enterprise Development Group. And to some sense that might create a conflict of interest in some people's minds in terms of voting in favor of the money that the city could possibly put into this feasibility study. So I want to be clear about that, and I'm ready to recuse myself on that vote if that's what would be appropriate. I do want to add one thing about incubators. There's hundreds of these things around the United States. They follow, they're always in sort of found space, often in industrial areas and abandoned warehouses and older buildings that are not competitive by their age or their location or their design or their function. But what they're designed to do is to literally, I mean, that's why they're called incubators, is to incubate new businesses, not established businesses, unless they might be something that's in somebody's home and they've got to move out. And typically the way these work is that businesses apply and they get accepted, and they have the opportunity to have office space that's well below the typical market space for that kind of footage that they would be renting. And they get to use that space for a period of usually 2 years. And then they're sort of like birds out of a nest. They're fledged and required to move out so that others can take advantage of the situation. In a meeting recently with Patty Baker of the OTBA, co-executive director, she was saying to me, I think it was just about less than 2 weeks ago, that she gets so many inquiries from people who are interested in moving their businesses into Tacoma Park that she said, and I know she was exaggerating when she said this, but it just gives you a flavor that she thought it would be no difficulty whatsoever in finding businesses from the Tacoma Park area to occupy space in there. So I said, gee, gosh, there's our marketing study. Now we're done. We don't need to do a marketing study. But we're going, that may be done. I don't know. But we will, the business planning, there'll have to be a business plan created and all that. One of the things that made me think this building, and this would be my last comment, would be appropriate for a business incubator is that it's been unoccupied for at least 7 years that Mr. Ramirez, that you know of, at least since you've owned it, about 6 or 7 years. And before that, and it's in a difficult place for an office building. If it were in another section of New Hampshire Avenue surrounded by other businesses sort of like it, it might be a very different story. But where it is, with the Jiffy Lube on one side, a motorcycle sales business on the other, and the substation across the street, it's kind of isolated. And that, plus the fact that it is so deteriorated, it just requires so much money to get it viable, puts that building at a huge disadvantage. The nice thing about an incubator is that the building doesn't have to be built out to a grade A quality office building in order to find a tenant. Not even grade B. It can be left with raw concrete floors. Doesn't have to have finished floors. It doesn't have to have necessarily floor-to-ceiling partitions. There's all kinds of other ways in which the building can become functional as a business incubator that would be far less expensive than if you had to build it out and make it ready for brand new, established businesses who are ready to pay market rates to move into that building. Now, this doesn't mean, obviously, that this is how it's going to end up. The working committee fully understands that an incubator is just one possibility, but it is at least seemingly at this point perhaps the most feasible possibility. We might find when we get the feasibility study done that or the Potomac Conference might find that when the feasibility is done, that, wow, maybe by spending X the number of dollars, we can find a way to put this building to some other use. I don't know. We don't know. But that's where we are at the present time, and why we're headed in that direction. And Councilmember Smith raised a good question in his turn about, well, would the Potomac Conference be able to do this study on their own? And Mr. Ramirez, you commented, yes, possibly you could. That's a consideration. But we've talked about this in our working group, and I think the city wants to put some money into this so that we can be your partner, so that we can have some say in the future use of this building and how it gets reused. And so that rather than just not have any say at all. And for the cost of $14,000, I think, which is what we're talking about here, it's a small cost thinking of the enormous potential this building has. 18,000 square feet could hold easy 24 small startup businesses in it in terms of job creation. And Steve Wilson, the treasurer of the Potomac Conference, said that the building right now is an embarrassment to them. And second of all, the idea of an incubator indicates a community purpose, which from the standpoint of the church's values and ethical outlook would be more in keeping with what the church's mission is in serving the community than it would be to put it to some other kind of use. I don't mean to put words in your mouth. I'm just relating what he has said, and he's been expressed a great deal of excitement about the potential of going in this direction. Thank you.
Councilmember Mayo.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you for coming out tonight. I get why this is an incubator proposal. I get the public benefit that we would potentially get in the city from having a dynamic workspace like that in the community. I don't know if Roz, if you have been and toured, or either of you have toured the Affinity Labs in D.C. or Fort D.C., Fortify D.C. They're two very successful incubators downtown. When I think of an incubator space, I think of those spaces, which are just sort of amazing, exciting, vibrant places to work. And I would urge the city to do a bit more investigation. And Councilmember Councilmember Smith alluded to this too, in evaluating some of the existing incubator spaces and how well they're working or not. But in particular, Affinity Labs downtown has been, I think, very, very successful, and that might affect some of the design or some of the build out that you would want to look at in terms of how that space was set up. So that's one piece that I'm interested in. A question for city staff: what is the range of sizes of the facade grants that we have given?
I think the smallest has been
A few hundred.
Yeah, under 1,000.
And what's the biggest?
And the largest, the legacy, we have facade grants that are community legacy money and facade easement grants that are CDBG money. Mm-hmm. So the largest is a CDBG grant, and it's probably 42,000, something like that.
So I was just thinking about this in the context of, if we're willing to put $10,000 to $40,000 into changing the aesthetic of the front of a building, how does this investment compare to that? So that just helps me sort of judge the scale of the project. So I just, in closing, I'm supportive in general of the project idea. I would, though, really like the city staff to follow up on some of the other, being able to provide us with some sort of summary of how well or poorly incubators are working in the D.C. area. And I identified some, but there are, as Councilmember Schultz alluded to, more. And the one in Silver Spring, I guess I'm particularly interested in, and some of the issues I think we would have, and some of the issues that the managers or the owners of those spaces could talk to us about, is how proximity to other services affects the tenants. The tenants you attract, the tenants you're able to keep for a 2-year period or however long. But if you were able to come back with some of that information and it confirmed the sort of viability of doing a viability study, then I would be supportive. Thank you.
So it sounds like I'm hearing from my colleagues generally supportive, request for a little bit more information. What else do you need? What are the time frames? How does coming back with more information affect time frames?
Well, I can come back for another work session, is that what you're suggesting, with more information? Or I can circulate that to you and you can give us direction on what you think the next steps should be.
I would think that we could come back with something that you could act on, but have this additional information for that discussion. I don't want to keep coming back and forth unless it's really needed.
Right. Mr. Landis.
Just to add real quickly, we definitely want to do some studies. We've included some time in here to look at 2 or 3 other incubators, one in Virginia, one in Silver Spring, one in Rockville, and I was not familiar with the labs in D.C., but check that out and maybe get some information from them, look at their business models, ask them questions. What would they do differently? What did they do? What have they done successfully, for sure?
So is my assessment correct that we're generally supportive of going forward with this, but we would like a little bit more information before committing to putting it on the agenda for a voting item?
And for me personally, I'm happy with the way the city manager just portrayed that, which is information in the context of moving forward as opposed to information in another work session.
Okay. Is that good with people?
Straw vote or do you? Yeah.
I want to see a no.
Fine.
Okay, and lacking that, it sounds like we will gather a little bit more information and come back and with that information for a voting session.
Okay.
Good. Thank you all.
Thank you.
And we are now at our last item, which is a discussion of the Memorandum of Understanding with State Highway Administration and the related legislation. Before we get started, let me just say that the time frame on this sounded like there was a little bit of confusion on the part of some of the public in terms of where the proposed legislation piece came from. The city has been working with the State Highway Administration for a potential MOU on this for a number of years now. Only at the very end of the process did I believe the city attorney say, gee, there's concerns about the potential widening of the roadway. There is a section of state code that addresses limiting funding to be spent by the State Highway Administration or the state on particular road projects in particular locations. If we can request the crafting of language, since it gets drafted by the Department of Legislative Services at the state for any potential state litigation, this would be something that we could add as an add-on to the MOU so that it would enhance the MOU and provide some protections that we were not able to get through the MOU. And so that's why this piece has appeared kind of at the very end of this process and is basically riding along with it because it's part of the same discussions with State Highway Administration over the MOU. So I hope that provides a little bit of clarity about why this is under discussion at this point. And with that, I'll turn it over to the city manager.
Sure, I can start in. I think, yes, it has been many years, and I think, I kind of blank out how long it's been, just
I think it's been
for
4 years.
sanity.
I think it's been 4 years.
That sounds about right. As was mentioned earlier this evening, there's been a little bit of turnaround with State Highway on this effort that we've been doing. I think we're at a point where we have a remarkably strong package of protections for Tacoma Park related to Maryland 410. And the MOU that's included in the package, I think, is a very good, workable MOU. It reinforces that from the state's perspective, there's not an intention to widen the road. Nevertheless, it does talk about how we kind of go through on a day-to-day basis about how State Highway would maintain the road and how we would have consultation. It also does not limit any of the protections that we already have and the authorities that we have traditionally in this road. The added legislation piece is remarkably strong. It is something that other communities don't have. It is really only something, the MOU and the legislation is something that we can get precisely because there's been such a modeled history of who owns 410. For a while, SHA maintains it, then they say, no, we don't own it, you have to maintain it. It's had an uncertain history, and we have taken that opportunity to get language that no other place has in Maryland. And I think that we have a very small window to get this in. I'm hoping that we can do so. It does not mean that we as a community aren't vigilant, that we don't have other kind of protections, and we think about what goes through on any particular proposal. But the overall protections, the 99% is here, and I really do hope that it's seen as a great benefit for Tacoma Park. Sue, did you want to say anything specific?
No, I appreciate both the mayor's statements and the city manager's statements. I only would add, I guess, that we've had this metaphor about incubators tonight, and I feel like we have been incubating this for 4 years, and now it's time to give birth. It really is time to make some decisions on this. I would like to say that I don't want to see the legislation piece held up by additional public hearings or additional time around the MOU, because that has its own deadlines. It already missed the filing deadline for all House of Delegate bills. We have the ability of getting some help from the Rule Committee to push it back some, but it can't be pushed back much more than a week or two. So although the bill has come up late in the process and is now in front of you, it's actually the thing that I would recommend tonight get launched, even if we need some more time on the MOU, if the council feels that that requires more of a public airing.
And could you just say a little bit more about both the process on the MOU in terms of what I'm thinking about is the back and forth with State Highway Administration about testing a number of different pieces of language, and the kind of the fact that it can't just be what we want, because if it's going to be an MOU, it's got to be signed by both parties, and then the anything else about the process for the state bill. I'm thinking along the lines of the fact that the bill has to be the bill language has to be basically drafted by the Department of Legislative Services, because they draft all state legislation, and they have certain criteria that they have to follow in doing that.
Well, you've actually answered your own question beautifully. I would just add that in terms of the bill, we're actually not very far apart from even what Historic Tacoma was promoting tonight. Everybody was agreeing on most of the language. I would say 90% of the language. The only difference was whether to specify that it would be a motor vehicle lane that can't be added, which our proposal in front of you suggests.
That's not the only concern. I'll address that when I get a turn to speak, though.
That's the major one. There's some other subtle ones. But in any case, it's what I think is that we have a great deal of agreement about what needs to be done with this, and that the the differences are actually overstated. There are really only a few ones that need to get ironed out. In terms of the negotiation, it is true that during these 4 years, we have been exchanging ideas, negotiating back and forth, back and forth, back and forth, as you always do in any negotiation. And I really think we're at the end of the road. There is not much give anymore. Quite a few of the suggestions that were made tonight by Historic Tacoma, whom I respect enormously, are ones that we've already tried and we have not been able to achieve. They're not new ideas. They're simply a wish list of things we hoped we could achieve. What we think we have gotten and we're putting in front of you tonight is the best package that can be gotten, and we are afraid of losing the opportunity to bring that home. So I did want to say that. The aspect of the bill that also is requiring sort of a two-sided negotiation is that we have been advised by the city's lobbyist that there's no way we can get this bill through the General Assembly without SHA agreeing not to oppose it. They have agreed to the language that's in front of you. We can't promise that they will agree to anything else.
There was something else I was going to ask you, but I don't remember what it was. It just slipped my mind. If it comes back, I'll ask you. Council comments on the MOU and the legislation. Councilmember Grimes.
Thank you. So yeah, I guess I would find it helpful, Ms. Silber, if you would go through the document that the Historic Tacoma gave us earlier this evening. Do you have a copy, a marked up version?
I do.
And there are probably about 10 changes that they're suggesting here. Which of them have been tried, if not exactly, substantially, and rejected, and which ones haven't?
Well, in some cases, it's not the precise language that's been objected, it's the general thrust of it that we have tried many times. So
Are any of their,
so for example,
are there any of their suggestions haven't been tried yet and possibly viable?
Well, some are trivial, some are little language suggestions that I don't think would be a problem. But for example, the language on page 3, which is Roman numeral 2B, through this MOU, the city grants SHA permission to undertake this maintenance beyond the existing edge of the curb along the Maryland 410 area. That we've tried, that concept has been tried and has failed. The concept at the very end, which I think is an important one, but we have not been able to succeed, is on F. It says, in all instances, page 7, no permit shall be issued until all city issues have been resolved to the satisfaction of the city and SHA. We have tried going back and around on that kind of concept that we would be an equal partner many, many times, and the most we could get was this concept of consultation and that we're entitled to a response. But there was never a concept that we would have, sort of equal authority or equal decision-making, even though we, of course, want that.
Yeah, I'm not sure that Mr. Neil Peterson didn't go beyond what we have here now, but that's seems to be history.
Well, that's exactly part of my point. I'm glad you made that one, because personnel keeps changing. The head of the Department of Transportation is open now. We don't know who will be in that position. One of the main people we've been negotiating with left the SHA today. Tomorrow. Well, as of today, but tomorrow he'll be gone. He's been remarkably reasonable, and we've got much further with him than we did by any predecessor. And we don't know who the next, what the next kind of team is going to look like.
Or the one after that.
Or the one after that. But I mean, the thing that amazes me is I really think we have so much to bring home at this point, to be able to have this kind of legislation and this kind of MOU. Admittedly, it is not perfect. It would never be perfect, but it is the best we're going to get, and I would hate that we would sort of lose this opportunity in the pursuit of the perfect.
My recollection is that the council, quite some time ago, discussed that it could write some kind of, I don't know what we called it, a cover letter or a memorandum that would be external to the MOU with the State Highway Administration that would contain certain assertions that the State Highway Administration would not accept in the MOU. Those assertions would lay out our interpretation on certain points that we'd like interpreted. Do I make any sense here?
You make total sense.
Would they object to that if we did
This
it?
is part of the deal, actually, is that in addition to the written agreement that we will sign and be bound to, both sides are going to probably try to explain their own additional points of view.
My recollection is I
And,
used the wrong word there. I called it a codicil, and you said that has a meaning that doesn't relate to the situation. So, yeah,
Well,
but
a
it's an external
codicil,
document.
again, is going to be agreement.
Yeah.
But yes, we talked about each side sort of telling their own thoughts about this deal for posterity, and we will probably do that.
So some of our interests could be included here. Okay, I don't have anything more to say about the draft MOU at the moment. Regarding the state legislative text, what we have before us is addition of a new through lane for motor vehicles. Ms. Moynihan is in the audience. I assume that is the current working language. Is that correct? It hasn't changed since this packet was printed. The white one is the one that counts. The blue is a briefing backgrounder, and it's the white one that counts.
One is talking about the purpose statement, and one is the language of the legislation.
Yeah.
That's my...
So the current legislation says a new through lane for motor vehicles. Would you mind?
Ma'am? Yeah.
And this is Moira Moynihan.
Sorry, Mr. Mayor, it's Maura Moynihan.
Maura Moynihan,
Heather
okay.
Reserve's Legislative Director. So, Councilman Grimes, I have an Attorney General's opinion that hopefully will help allay your fears about any improvements to the bus bays.
Would you explain that, please? Oh, you're talking about the bus bays?
Yes.
All right. I raised a concern that the Federal Highway Administration, which sets standards that the State Highway Administration accepts for all kinds of stuff, defines adding a right turn lane or left turn lane on the side of a road as an auxiliary through lane, and an auxiliary through lane is a type of through lane. That is one concern I have. So after that explanation, what is the Attorney General's opinion?
The Attorney General's opinion, and my apologies, I don't have it in front of me, but I'm happy to share it with everyone, is that this language would permit for those construction and any kind of improvements that would need to occur, as I think recommended by the recent Tacoma Junction report.
Yeah, okay, the Tacoma Junction Task Force talked about that, and it's not something that has been discussed by the City Council because it's way premature to try to talk about any kind of changes to roadway configuration in Tacoma Junction. And personally, I'd say until after we have some idea about what the city will do with its lot, whether it will remain as is, be developed for community purposes, have a building or something like that. So thank you for checking with the Attorney General. There is also concern about, I have a concern with the revised language proposed by Historic Tacoma that would remove the words motor vehicles to say no through lane. And that is that the city has been planning on installing bicycle lanes on 410 east of New Hampshire Avenue, that is on the far side from most of Tacoma Park. I believe that part of the road is within the city of Tacoma Park. And it's creating bicycle lanes there is creating new lanes, even if they are just painted on there and don't involve widening the roadway, moving the curve line or anything like that. Does this language here spend any further funds for the construction, does that cover restriping the roadway? I don't know if anything further than restriping, but maybe to change the pavement to create bicycle lanes there. Would that be allowed on the 410 east of New Hampshire Avenue going toward Hyattsville?
With the HTI language?
Would the bicycle lanes be allowed there if we pass this language as it stands right? No, I'm sorry, with the HTI language,
With
yes.
the HTA line, I don't believe so. I think the bicycle lanes would not be able to be included there with that language. It is important, I think, for us to distinguish between a lane for motor vehicles and just a vehicle and just a lane.
Yeah, I will state that that the placement of bicycle lanes on that portion of 410 has been discussed for quite some time in a number of open public meetings, and I support that placement of bicycle lanes there. Therefore, I would object to the removal of for motor vehicles from this state text, despite Historic Tacoma's advocacy. Sorry about that. The other thing I have to address has nothing to do with the text, and it has to do with the process. When the City of Tacoma Park has made legislative requests on issues that do not relate to current city policy that have been enacted, and this MOU and all of that has not been enacted as city policy yet, other than that we're pursuing it. When we've done that, it's been by resolution, which is a form of official vote that specifically allows for notice to the public and public comment. This is separate from whether there is going to be a hearing, a public hearing for the MOU as a whole. I think it would be improper for the City of Tacoma Park to make a request to the state legislature to introduce legislation that has not gone through a resolution process. And I'll tell you now, well, no, I won't tell anyone now. I understand about filing deadlines that have passed and the extended filing deadlines and so on, but I would expect that if we are going to put a request into Delegate Missouri or any other legislator for this, that there be a resolution with proper notice and public comment. That's all. Thank you.
And I remembered the question that I was going to ask before I go to Councilmember Mayle. I just wanted to have you remind us of the any link between the signing of the MOU and any work by State Highway on the potential work that they would be doing on the rebuilding of 410 Ethan Allen, or do they go ahead and do that no matter what because they own the road, or is it waiting on the signing of the MOU?
The repaving of Ethan Allen and
Yes.
410 is to go ahead in any event.
Okay. Is there any other work that is waiting on the MOU, or is this all dealing with the potential for further work? Is there anything else that is in the pipeline like that?
There's nothing that is contingent or waiting on the MOU.
Okay, thanks. Councilmember Mayle.
Thank you, Mayor. Maura, thank you for being up here, and thank you for your boss's work on this. I wanted to talk about the MOU first, but since you're up there, I'll address the legislation first. I think the one piece that Councilmember Grimes had not addressed from Historic Tacoma's comments, Historic Tacoma had suggested adding, and this is to anyone, or the city's attorney, had suggested, I think, adding the language construct or reconstruct. And my read of that was that it was potentially unnecessary because I would assume that construct referred broadly to any activity, including painting lanes. But I just don't know if any of you have more experience with that issue than I do.
In fact, originally the language did say construct or reconstruct, but we were given that information that the construction is what covers it all. It's in the purpose statement they have both, which kind of helps give clarification, but it covers it all.
It was State Highway's suggestion to use just construction rather than construction and reconstruction. It came from them.
Okay, thank you. And I don't have any other specific comments on the language of the legislation, except that I know how hard it is to get legislation that can make it through a process. I know that from federal experience. I'm assuming it's just as hard or harder at the state level. And I know that you in particular are doing something that is, it's a tweak for one community. And so there's no reason for 90% of everybody who works in the state legislature to support, or maybe not support, to not get involved in something like this. And so I appreciate the work that it takes to get something like this to move forward. And from my perspective, it represents a huge victory, because what constituents have talked to me about, what has been talked about for 4 years or longer, has been the fear of road widening for cars. And this language, from I think everyone's understanding of it, I haven't heard from Historic Tacoma that it wouldn't serve this purpose as well. It will prevent another lane of cars being added to 410 within Tacoma Park. And that's a great victory in my view. So I will leave it at that, and I appreciate the additions we've had, the discussion we've been able to have about the specific comments from Historic Tacoma here. And I know that you and your boss have also been speaking with members from Historic Tacoma, and so you've had a chance to weigh some of these considerations as well. So thank you for that. On the MOU, I just want to say first that with regard to the question of permits that came up before, I appreciate that was one of the very first issues that I brought up when serving on council when we first discussed this. And I know that the attorney and city staff went back to SHA with a number of different permutations of ways that the city could have authority, control, longer time periods. And I know that you bounced those things off of SHA, and I appreciate that work. And we have made improvements in the versions that I have seen in the last year and a half. So thank you for that. That work on the MOU. We've had public hearings in the last 4 years on this subject a couple of times. Is that right?
Yes.
We've had 6-ish council sessions.
That sounds about right.
Okay.
One of these days I'll write it down just so I have it in front of me. But
Including comments. We had a discussion
had
a month
many-
ago or 2 months ago.
yes, 2
Okay.
months ago.
And these documents have been available to the public for a couple of weeks.
That's right.
And there'll be public comment. If we have this next week, there'll be
Yes.
public comment as well next week. The city attorney you have met with, well, some council members and the city attorney have met with the board and the attorney for Historic Tacoma once.
And I've also had a number of phone conversations with that attorney as well.
Okay. And there have been different versions of language going back and forth through all of that language that city and Historic Tacoma went back and forth on, language that we went back and forth on with SHA about as well. Is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Thank you. I just give me 1 second. There are, I guess, in my view, there are a couple of, and Diane Cohen from Historic Tacoma mentioned these tonight. There are a couple of suggestions in here that seem more minor, but they were mentioned in testimony. I don't know if those are clarification issues or if they sort of are substantive changes. And so on some of those things, for example, the whereas clause where it would say state, comma, Montgomery County and the city. I don't know that I'm not certain that adds protection for us in any way. If there are chances to move small pieces like that forward, I would certainly support that. On other changes, for example, city granting authority to SHA, I know we've gone through that before. We've had other versions of language very similar to this, and we've gone through that before and have not been able to make progress with those exact versions, but you've made progress in other ways. I remember the other change I was looking at. Removal of fallen trees is added in here.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of those things which I think are minor clarifications that may be easily acceptable.
Okay. That was one that I was, I guess, particularly interested in, although we cover vegetation in other ways.
Right.
So it may not be necessary because
was necessary just, 3 months ago?
Well, in that case, I mean, that went back to the idea that SHA wasn't responsible for maintenance, because the word had got down to all of their different divisions that they were supposed to clean up, that they were in charge of,
Fallen trees.
in charge of 410.
Right.
I mean, it wasn't about fallen trees, it was about doing anything. And so part of the reason that this MOU has been pushed for so long is so that the agencies, and State Highway in particular, with its multiple, thousands of staff, actually have a document that says they're supposed to do maintenance on 410. And I think, there really has been confusion over the years. We wanted to clear that up.
Right. Well, my final comment is really that I believe that both the legislation and an MOU are important and helpful to us, and that they've been worth working on for 4 years. And so in moving forward, I don't want us to do anything that jeopardizes the chances of getting what we have won so far going forward. My assessment of what we've gotten so far in the MOU and the state legislation is that these are very good, and both of them provide significant improvements from where we would be if we didn't have either of them. And in particular, the two of them together, fit very nicely. So in my comments, saying that if we can make some more of these tweaks, I'm supportive of that, is true, but only with the caution that I don't want those efforts to jeopardize getting an MOU or getting the legislation to move forward. And in particular, that's because I know some of what are clearly more substantive changes suggested by Historic Tacoma, larger changes, like for example the mention of the easement. We've talked about those before. So in my mind, those are things that, for me at least, I've moved past them. We're not going to be able to get those, and I understand that. There are some other pieces in here which are more subtle and which are new, and so if there's a chance to make progress in those, I would say do so. But I really appreciate the work that's gone into this, and I think both represent a big step forward for us. And I just hope we don't do anything as a community that jeopardizes our chances to get these two things to happen, because I think that if we fail after this much time, no one's going to have the energy or the will to do it again. So, thank you.
Councilmember Schultz.
Ms. Moynihan, you and I spoke earlier this week, and you gave me some insights that I needed to have gained, and I appreciate your help and helping me understand. And I'm wondering if you might be appropriate to kind of repeat what you told me with regard to Delegate Mazier's concern about the need to keep this proposed legislation under the radar, so to speak.
Well, sure. In our conversations with SHA, it seemed like, they were concerned about setting this precedent, because it's kind of, we've got it in law one other time, and so they don't want this to be something where they're dealing with requests from other municipalities year in and year out. And so they're giving us their support on the issue, but I think that if we have a lot of controversy, then it'll be really tough to pass, and they might pull their support from the bill, and I think the chances of passing the bill in a following year will be that much more difficult. So maybe getting our differences ironed out prior to the bill hearing, and hopefully before we actually submit the final language, would be ideal from our perspective.
Yeah, thank you. I would just add to that is that the reason that I understand that the SHA is kind of willing to go this far with us in terms of supporting a bill like this is regarding what our city manager was just saying here at the outset, is that the SHA made such a mess of things, changing their positions, saying yes, and then they'd say no, and then yes, and then that they realized that they kind of stumbled and made things more difficult for everybody, including themselves. So that's sort of why they sort of have felt, at least the current leaders of the SHA, have felt some sort of sense that they would like to go a little further than they might otherwise. Because I know very early on, I do recall this, is that they were very much concerned all along about, quote, setting a precedent where other municipalities would want to climb on. And that's my fear, is that it doesn't take much for somebody in a different part of the state sort of saying, that's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So, thank you for that. One of my concerns is that if we were to go with the HTI language on removing the wording on the proposed legislation about motor vehicles, that would in a sense prevent us from putting a bike lane, theoretically, because it would be, quote, a vehicle. But the problem is that would mean all of 410 and Tacoma Park would be in that situation. And a large piece of Route 410 along Ethan Allen Avenue is not in the historic area. So if the community in that area was insisting on really wanted to have a continuation of a bike lane that comes from further east, they would be prevented from having it at least on that section of 410, which I don't think would be fair. I just wanted to point that out. Ms. Silver, I wanted to ask you on the MOU, if I may, on page 3 under utility permits, one of the suggestions that HTI's representatives made tonight was where it says in the middle of that paragraph big paragraph under utility permits to have 3 business days from the date, the suggestion to have that change from 3 to 30. And I am going to bet that that's something that's already been talked about with SHA.
Yeah, I appreciate you asking that question because I wanted to sort of be able to explain this to all of you. Yes, we had hoped to get originally everything would be 10 days. SHA described the fact that they had an internal guideline that required a much faster turnaround, and that it was very important to them that it be closer to 3 days. So we checked with our public works director, and she was in the meeting, in the discussion. She was very comfortable with the 3-day turnaround, that she could do that.
Okay.
This is not a kind of situation where one is going out to the whole public and the community for input. This is one that staff needs to be able to act quickly, and she felt that Public Works could do that within the 3 days. Most of this agreement, if you notice, is a 10-day turnaround, and staff was comfortable with that as well. We certainly vetted this through our own staff. The 30 days would just never be able to fly.
Oh, okay. I mean, I thought there would be I just wanted to make sure that those conversations have been held, and we know why it's 3 and not another number.
Yes, we actually went back to Darrell when we saw the concern and asked once again, is she sure that 3 days is feasible for her, and she does feel that it is.
One other follow-up question then, not textual, is with regard to your conversations with the attorney for Historic Tacoma. You've had, I presume, I mean, I'm just asking for you to confirm or explain it, pretty much continuous or periodic discussions or working with her, have you not?
Yes, and I've often offered more than has been responded to. But when we've actually talked, I think we've had some very good conversations. Sometimes afterward, when I see the result, I'm wondering if there really was, I was really listened to or heard. For example, on this piece, we discussed the issue of time limits, and so I was surprised to see the 30 days come in at this juncture.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, there's a difference between I'm saying the obvious, that not having tried to get a change, and having tried, and knowing that there's firm reasons from the state's point of view why something can't be done. And I think those are just what we're trying to parse out here.
And I want to just give credit to Historic Tacoma's attorney. I think she has been very thoughtful and very creative and has, given us some ideas which we have been able to use. So it's not been all negative. It's actually been constructive.
Yeah, speaking of giving credit, I mean, it was a couple of months ago when Lorraine Pearsall stood before us and in a great explosion of passion and deep concern, told us in no uncertain terms, us, the City Council, that we hadn't done a good enough job. And at the time, I was a little frustrated, but I realized that in the ensuing period of time, we have made some good progress with SHA. So I think I would hope that it would go without saying, but I'll say it anyway, is that HTI, I think, has been a positive influence on our work with SHA. I probably would have given in a long time ago. Thank you. That's all I have to say.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. First, thank you, Ms. Moynihan, for coming. Now, go ahead and say, I just want to thank you for coming tonight, spending the time with us, and also for Delegate Mazur's work on this and attention to this important topic here in Tacoma Park. Ms. Silver, I know you remember that I had been less than enthusiastic about this agreement, and especially since we found that SHA is going to go ahead and do the maintenance that we have always felt was our due, and yet, we sit here tonight, a lot of work's been put into this, and I just like to make sure that I understand, kind of what are the potential gains and what are the risks, what do we potentially lose, whether we go ahead and ask for this legislation and this agreement, or if we don't do it. I think the key things are we want to get the road maintained. We want the state to maintain the road and repave it and do whatever other maintenance is required on it as it needs to be done. We don't want the road to be widened to accommodate additional lanes of automobiles, right? But we might like to have a bike lane through sometime, or some other type of work that may have some widening effect on the road surface itself. Maybe that's stormwater or something else. So I guess the question is, I have two questions. One is, which is having this legislation and agreement or not having it give us a stronger assurance that the maintenance and repaving will be done by SHA, or is it neutral? Is it the same?
Well, the bill doesn't go to the maintenance. The bill goes to the question of widening, and it's the best thing we have to prevent the widening to the third lane that everybody fears. The MOU is what provides a clear obligation to maintain the road and pay for those costs by State Highway.
But if they've already told us that they're going to do that, does it give us anything that we don't have already?
Yes, because any administration can change that position. They can say, now we'll do it, and then down the road a different governor says we won't, or a different transportation secretary says, no, that we won't do it, we'll change that. It leaves it, instead of up to the whim of each administrative decision,
Excuse me,
to
that
an
wouldn't be
actual
Ms.
agreement.
Mazur, though. She wouldn't, if she was governor, she wouldn't say that, right? Okay, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I think we'd be safe with Heather.
No comment from up there.
But the point is, it's much safer for us to have a memorandum like this that is bilateral, that's enforceable, that we know what we can rely on. compared to just things changing because edicts change in the administration.
Weren't some of the other concerns things like the utility work that we had grave concern with, and we're getting more of a formal role in those types of things?
Yeah, the whole list of specifics I haven't even mentioned, but all of those are not only helpful because they show who has responsibility and who has accountability, but also it clarifies things for our staff and our community as to who do you call when something's not getting done.
All right, let's back up to the other side, or switch over to the other side then. If SHA said that they wanted to widen the road to handle an additional lane of vehicular travel, then would having this agreement give us a stronger position, or a weaker position, or a neutral
I
effect
think
on
the
that?
agreement is neutral on that, which is why I'm so in favor of advocating for the legislation as well. It's neutral on that issue.
Okay, but the legislation would be better than where we are today.
Absolutely, enormously better. It's the best we could hope for.
All right, so that was with an exclamation point.
That's right, two of them.
Okay. All right, I thank you.
Okay, right, the exclamation.
Yeah, I know, we got
Yes.
to get the exclamation points right there.
Before I go to Councilmember Smith, I had one or two additional points that I wanted to cover to make sure that we get clarity on those particular parts of language proposed by HTI. One I don't think we've talked about is on page 7, letter H. SHA will submit to review by the Montgomery County Historic Preservation Commission and the Maryland Historic Trust. And I know that's been of some concern in terms of the Montgomery County Historic Preservation Commission's authority comes from the county, and if the state is passing authority to the county, does the state have to submit to anything? And I think that status is different than the Maryland Historical Trust.
Yes, I mean, SHA does require, does have to go through the Maryland Historic Trust when there's historic areas. It's a Section 106 review process. In my experience, the Historic Trust is, I think, more lenient than some local preservation boards about how sidewalks are dealt with and that kind of thing. If it is within the right-of-way and it's traditional kinds of paving, curbs, sidewalks, unless there's something about a particular location that's particularly historic and that sidewalk is historic or something, they tend to give an okay to State Highway to do the work. Nevertheless, it does need to go through that review process. With our work for the city, we do submit information through the Montgomery County system. So.
Right, so that depending on how the authority is seen for a particular action, the city has to jump through more hoops than the state.
Yes.
And that's always the way it is because we're a creation of the state.
It also has to do with kind of the different role and when there's federal funds involved, which primarily is what State Highway does work with, so it primarily does require the Section 106 review. But that's, if you start doing widening, if you start going into the properties, area of the properties, there's very stringent review of State Highway.
Okay, that's helpful. And another question came up on page 4 under signs, that was the only section where it said in the event that SHA determines in its sole and absolute discretion, and that language had been removed from other sections.
We had tried on that one. I remember the exact dialogue on that, trying to get more discretion and more involvement by the city. We wanted smaller signs and better aesthetics
Different
for the
fonts
sign.
and all kinds of, and we wanted different poles.
Because I remember we had
We've tried.
we had pictures of people standing under the signs.
Right. We've tried calling attention to the options of pilot agreements, and that is a place that we did hit the brick wall. They have adopted federal sign standards. They made it part of Maryland sign standards, but the Maryland standards don't have the flexibility that the federal ones do, and they're sticking with that.
Okay, thanks for that clarification. And the final point I just want to make about, as people have talked about the potential for adding bike lanes and the piece on the east side of New Hampshire Avenue as opposed to other areas, the example that I came up with in thinking about this that I just want to mention is the potential, if it was deemed a good idea, to link bicycle lanes on Piney Branch Road to somehow get to Montgomery College. I came up with the scenario of potentially wanting to add a bike lane on the 65 feet of Philadelphia Avenue between Piney Branch and Boston to link to then get people to go up to Boston rather than putting the bike lane on Philadelphia as being something that would be potentially reasonable to do to get people to where there would be a number of bicycle commuters, and it would be an example of where having the language that restricts the additional lanes to motorized vehicles makes more sense, not to exclude potential addition of a 5-foot bike lane on one side for 65 feet, taking what is, I think I remember correctly, is city property there on the corner where it just tends to be grassy and some signs go up saying, festival coming or whatever it is. That those types of things are the flexibility that's needed in that language. Councilmember Smith.
Thank you, Mayor. Sue, I would like to thank you for all your hard work on this. I know we have been working on this, even though I've been on the council for a limited amount of time. We've had a lot of sessions talking about this. On HTI, I would support some of their changes, but if we cannot get to a final MOU by Friday, close of business Friday, I think that's the most important thing. I think that where we are right now is a final agreement. I think that all the things that are important for the city, the major issues of not widening the road, of maintenance of the road, I think they are in the MOU. I think these minor language changes are okay, but if we don't have them, I could live without them. Ms. Monahan, thank you. Can you tell me, what is the strategy, or is there a strategy that Heather has, and what's the process once we agree, the council agrees with the legislation? What's next?
We would submit our amendments and formally introduce the bill, and then it would get recommended to the Rules Committee, which Delegate Sheila Hickson sits on and has assured us that she'll help us get the bill out. And usually if you have a good reason for rules, like this is a local matter and it took us a little bit past the 22nd to get there, that's a perfectly acceptable reason, and I don't see why we would have a hard time getting it out of that committee. Then it would go to the Committee of Jurisdiction and be heard, and then, I would imagine pass out of committee, pass through the House, pass through the Senate.
Okay. All right, thank you.
And can you just provide a little bit more detail about where the legislature is in the process of considering bills? My recollection is that there are bill hearings scheduled out well into March. Where are we in terms of the crunch of bills and going through the legislature? Kind of where do these things fall in terms of the remaining 2 months of the session?
Absolutely. The crossover date, the date we would absolutely have to have the bill passed through the House is March 25th. So I would imagine, the latest possible House hearing date we could settle for would be the third week of March. So we have some time, probably a month and a half to work with. Ideally, we'd like to get the bill in sooner rather than later, because Rules only meets a couple times a session and not regularly because it's comprised of all the chairs of the standing committees, so it's hard to get them all in a room at once.
So sooner is better.
Yes. I'd also just like to point out, unless I'm misunderstanding the discussion, this language in Section 3 would permit the construction of bike lanes.
Right.
So, okay.
Right.
everyone's on the same page there. All right.
Councilmember Siemens, did you have a follow-up to something?
Yeah, Councilmember Smith said this MOU, but it's an MOA, isn't it? Or is it an MOU?
This is an MOU.
MOU, okay.
The previous discussion was an MOA.
I know, you got me so confused. All right. Never mind.
Councilmember Mayo.
Thank you. I appreciated the comments from a couple of constituents. I just wanted to read one sentence, I think fairly characterizing from each one of them. Ms. Laura Charkoudian said, I understand that the language may not be seen as perfectly by some, but that's often the nature of legislation. We're much stronger with than without it. And Sally Tabor, the former president of the Saska Neighborhood Association, said, I hope that your discussion on Monday can resolve any outstanding issues and that the council can move swiftly forward in signing this MOU with SHA so we can start addressing issues. And she goes on to talk about the issues we're trying to work on. The last comment I wanted to make concerns Councilmember Grimes' question or critique earlier about process. And I just wanted to ask some questions about how we deal with legislation that we support. So, for example, the stormwater bill that Delegate Hucker was pushing forward, 2 bills. And we talked about those. We, I think, had a straw vote on them. But did we actually do a resolution or?
The way that we do these is if we have kind of standing positions, we don't need a resolution. The standing positions are items that the council's taken specific position on, or if it is something that enhances, if it gives more money to the city, if it gives more authority to the city,
Sure, okay.
Those are standard things that we don't need to have resolutions on.
So we as council, and actually the previous council as well, because I think in the previous session there was actually a resolution that identified sort of 4 principles of negotiation for the city with regard to the MOU. We have established and voted on the idea of trying to make widening of 410 to try to establish that, right? We, this council, and the previous council have both had motions to that effect, I believe.
Yes, and there's been resolutions related to that.
And the only thing that we haven't done is specifically link it to legislation, but we've given the city staff, I think, a mandate that we want you to make it less likely that we get another motor vehicle lane on 410, I think.
That's correct. So in the way that we work things here, a resolution, in my opinion, would not be required. As I mentioned, I responded to Councilmember Grimes earlier today, I always think resolutions are good things. I don't have a problem with having resolutions. I think it helps establish very clearly the position of the council. When there's a standing kind of position, it can be done with a straw vote and direction. It can be done with sometimes a letter from the council, and it can also be done by a resolution. So those are options that you all have.
And when we advocate for legislation through MML, have we brought those particular bills to the council before?
We always have a resolution about when we ask for the
legislative action requests.
Legislative action requests. But there's many times when we identify for MML or we work with MML on bills that are just in our general interest. One of the things that happens, and we're not quite to the point yet in the session, but there's a point when stuff just drops remarkably quickly. And that's the reason that there's these standing directions so that we know how to respond to legislation as it pops up and without having to wait and schedule a resolution. There's some times when we still say we absolutely need a resolution, and we will make that point. But part of the reason for the direction of having some standing positions is so that we can react quickly on when things get really hectic.
Well, thank you. In this case, because the previous council had voted on something that gave direction in terms of making it more difficult to get a motor vehicle lane, because this council has done so as well, I feel like we've given that adequate direction. If we have time to move a resolution or do a straw vote, I think that's a good thing. But I feel like this idea of making it more difficult for SHA to add a motor vehicle lane is fairly well established in the council's deliberations. Thank you.
And let me just add something quick. on the subject you brought up about taking positions on legislation, and this question came up. I draw a line, a distinction between testifying on behalf of the city and testifying on behalf of the Maryland Municipal League, so that there are times when I am testifying, when I'm only testifying on behalf of MML or only on behalf of the city, and there are other times when I say I am testifying on behalf of both. And if I'm testifying on behalf of the city, it's because we already have the resolution or the direction that says this is our position. Councilmember Schultz.
I just wanted to take the opportunity to say something, because Councilmember Daniels Cohen isn't here tonight, to say this on her behalf, because we're all aware that as of last week, what her position was on this and on this issue, which was very much in favor of, as she would put it in her words, to get her done, to get this legislation into the state legislature and to get this MOU accomplished. And in fact, that was when we last heard from Jack Cohen, I believe it was, a couple days ago. She was hoping that she'd be able tonight to be able to call in specifically on this particular issue in case there was a straw vote. It turns out that we found out later she was not going to be able to do that. So, but I think I can't speak for her. I'm just reminding everybody here in this room that that was where she was at on this issue.
To the extent that when she was in the room waiting for an MRI on Friday, she was calling you and she was calling me and saying, "What's happening? You know, has the legislation dropped? Is the MOU ready? We have to do this."
So Comer Park City Council have a system of proxy voting. This seems to be trying to approximate that.
No, just a comment.
For a court of law, this would be inadmissible hearsay.
But it's not a court of law.
No, it isn't. So I want to explore two things. Councilmember Mayle, you said that if there's time you would support a resolution or a straw vote. You did say both of those. My understanding is that we would have another 8 days until after the council meets on Tuesday the 19th. Would our position, is that correct?
I don't know what the significance of that date is.
Well, it's when the council's going to meet again, 8 days from now. So in other words, what I'm...
I'd have to talk to Heather. That's a vote fine.
Oh, you're not going to talk to Heather right now. What I'm getting at is that I had the impression, which you are unable to confirm, that we did have time. In any case, this is a situation of a difference of opinion. Certainly, the two Councilmember Mayle and myself who have expressed opinions on whether a resolution is called for here. It's a difference of interpretation, and I'll just reiterate my interpretation that when the council has specifically made legislative requests, including on things that had been part of city policy previously, legislative requests have had resolutions. You brought up specifically the Maryland Municipal League. For instance, I know one that I was involved in, personal property taxes for financial institutions. That was in 2 successive years for the council, in the council legislative request to the Maryland Municipal League. And it was included both times, and it would have been I guess one of those times actually was this last year. In any case, it's because legislative requests are matters of priority for the city and realization that if we go after too much, then we will perhaps not get anything. So, for instance, this last year we chose to focus on transportation funding and the Purple Line and so on, and sometimes you choose to focus on things and put aside other things that are would be on your agenda otherwise. So once again, I will assert that it has been the City Council's practice, so far as I've observed, that legislative requests do go through resolutions, and I do materially see that this current legislative request is something new, because it is new in form, even if not in general position. And, okay, I will add one more thing, which is that there is clear lack of agreement that this current text accomplishes what the community wishes it would accomplish. So I'll just reiterate that I think this should go to a resolution, and it should wait a week, noting that I had suggested a resolution in far enough ago that it could have been done this evening.
City Manager.
Yeah, I do want to mention that the legislative action requests are required by MML procedures to be by a resolution. It's not something that we would necessarily need to do for positions that we've taken in prior councils. Nevertheless, one option is to request that the legislative drafting and filing go forward, and if the City Council, and have a resolution on this at an upcoming meeting, and if the council changed its mind, the bill could be pulled, could be withdrawn.
I don't have any illusion that you're going to that you're not going to do a straw vote now. It's the mayor's prerogative to do that. I don't have an illusion that you're going to wait those 8 days. But I feel I need to say this, and it's a genuine request all the same.
And I'll say I haven't heard anything that tells me that we have to make the request and drop the bill in the next day or 2 or 3. It sounds like we can wait until after Tuesday night next week. And because I don't want to kind of give people the impression that we're going to just go ahead with this, with all of this, with the MOU and the legislation, despite what they say. I think we've heard a lot of information. We've heard a lot of people talk about it. And we've had requests for additional chance to comment on this, and I think we should take that opportunity to take the comment. So I would be happy to schedule a resolution for both the bill language and the MOU. We already have a tentative MOU resolution scheduled. My sense is that the council is satisfied that the language on both of them is as good as we can get it. So that's what's ready to go forward for resolution. If there's additional language that needs to be, or points to be made, I think there were some places where it was seen that some of the proposed additional language could be vetted this week, and we could have answers on that for next week. And we could have, there were requests for a public hearing. My sense is that if we schedule these items first up on the agenda, this is a chance for the public to be heard. If we had a public hearing, it would just be, okay, everybody take a chance for a public hearing, now come back and do it again when we vote on it. So we might as well just have the session, take the comments, introduce them, take comments, and vote. So I'd be happy to schedule kind of a joint piece for both of these.
Thank you.
For the resolution on Tuesday night, can we just do one resolution and include elements about both the MOU or the legislative language, or did you want 2 separate resolutions? I'm sorry? No, I'm just curious about which you prefer.
One is fine with me.
I can go either way.
I suggest 2. I think the community would appreciate the opportunity to comment separately on the legislative
That's
request
fine.
line.
Okay, so we'll do 2 separate resolutions, and we'll put them up front in the meeting so that people can be here and not be here at 11:25.
Sorry,
Councilmember Mail.
One more question, comment. For the city manager, we have a city lobbyist that we employ. In past years or in this session, does our lobbyist ever work with legislators to draft legislation that is introduced before the city council actually takes a formal position on it? In other words, there's the process of developing legislation, and then there's the process of the city publicly supporting that legislation. And they're 2 different things.
We've done it both ways.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. I think we've taken care of this item for this evening. Any additional information needed by staff? Thank you, Maura, for sticking with us. Appreciate it. We're adjourned.
Thank you very much.